Hello everyone. I am your storyteller, guiding you through a journey that will stir the shadows of your mind. Tonight, as you settle in, I invite you to like this video and subscribe, because what you're about to hear will linger long after the screen goes dark. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? What hour has embraced you? Now, settle yourself comfortably, and breathe deeply. Let the quiet pull you in. The first thing I noticed upon stepping into the cabin was how the shadows moved, wrong. My footsteps echoed hollowly on floorboards worn thin by decades of mountain winters, each creak a whispered warning. The real estate agent had warned me about the isolation, no cell service, no neighbors for miles, only the pine forest, endless and brooding, stretching toward jagged peaks that tore the sky's belly, gray and heavy with rain. But she never mentioned the shadow. My own shadow seemed detached, as if it dragged behind me, sluggish like it was wading through invisible molasses while I moved freely through the cold mountain air. I told myself it was exhaustion. The drive up the winding, serpentine road had lasted 8 grueling hours. Every sharp turn frayed my nerves. I felt eyes on me, unseen but palpable, lurking just beyond the thick curtain of trees. Unloading boxes from the truck left my muscles burning and my thoughts clouded. The cabin itself was older than its claimed 60 years. The pine walls had darkened to a sinister, dried blood hue, heavy with the scent of smoke and forgotten secrets. Scattered belongings hinted at former lives, a chipped coffee mug, a smoke-stained wool blanket, and a stack of brittle books with pages yellowed like ancient bones, as if the stories within had been long dead. As evening settled, I unpacked by a lone lamp casting harsh, flickering light. My shadow sprawled across the opposite wall, familiar yet wrong. When I lifted my hand to scratch my neck, my shadow lagged, a fraction of a second delayed, as if struggling to keep pace with my movements. My heartbeat sped. I froze. The shadow mirrored me again, but the delay was unmistakable. Logic battled panic, flickering bulb, poor lighting, altitude sickness, fatigue. Yet deep inside, my body screamed that something was terribly wrong. Cold sweat gathered at my neck's nape despite the cabin's chill. I forced myself to continue, moving slowly, eyes darting to the shadows every twitch. Sometimes it was perfectly aligned, other times hesitant, almost as if it was deciding whether to obey. That night, sleep deserted me. Whispers drifted through the cabin's creaking walls, slithering beneath the floorboards and curling around the ceiling beams, faint yet urgent, impossible to place or understand. My mouth dried, terror seized my throat as I strained to catch words from the smoky murmurs. The whispers came from nowhere and everywhere all at once. I fumbled for the lamp, fingers trembling. When the light flooded the room, the whispers abruptly ceased, as if silenced by unseen hands. But the shadows on the wall grew, no longer alone was my familiar shape. Dark, shapeless forms swarmed around it, phantoms without bodies or origin. My heart pounded like a trapped animal clawing to escape. I spun, desperate to locate the source, but the room lay empty, save for my scattered belongings and the suffocating scent of fear dripping from my skin. When I dared to look back, the extra shadows had vanished. Only my shadow remained, now perfectly synchronized with my movements. Sleep was a stranger that night. I sat by the window, gazing out at the forest beyond the glass. The trees stood still, skeletal branches clawing toward the cabin like gnarled fingers. But deeper in the darkness, shadows shifted between trunks, not the soft dance of leaves stirred by wind, but purposeful shapes patrolling the perimeter of my new home. By morning, my hands trembled so badly that making coffee was a trial. As darkness fell the next day, the whispers returned, clearer now, almost conversational, weaving through the night air like an unholy lullaby. As days passed, the cabin's grip tightened. I began noticing more anomalies, the faint scent of decayed earth seeping through the floorboards, cold drafts brushing past my neck though no window was open, and reflections in the mirror that didn't quite match my movements. Sometimes, the reflection's eyes lingered just a moment too long, brimming with silent warnings I couldn't decipher. One night, the whispers shaped into fragments of voices, distorted, yet achingly human. Please, warnings, laughter twisted into screams that echoed inside my skull long after the cabin had gone silent. A hidden door revealed itself beneath a threadbare rug. I pried it open to find a narrow staircase descending into pitch darkness. The air below was fetid, thick with the stench of mold and something far fouler, the unmistakable scent of death long buried. I hesitated, heart hammering like a drum of doom. But curiosity, or perhaps something darker, urged me onward. At the base of the stairs lay a room lined with peeling wallpaper and scattered personal effects, a child's toy missing an eye, a rusted locket, and faded photographs that looked impossibly old. The walls were scrawled with cryptic symbols, ancient, malevolent. A chilling cold enveloped me, as if the very air mourned a tragedy long forgotten. And then, the whisper came again, distinct and clear, "Leave, before it's too late." I don't know what haunted that cabin, or what I disturbed in those shadowed depths. But I know one thing, the darkness there was not just absence of light. It was a living, breathing presence, waiting, watching, and patient beyond comprehension. If you want to hear what happened next, and unravel the terrifying mystery piece by piece, stay with me until the end. This story will take you deep into the heart of fear itself, where every answer breeds more questions, and every shadow hides a secret waiting to be unleashed. They spoke of things buried deep in the mountain soil, secrets entwined with the roots of ancient trees, promises etched into the very bedrock and then shattered like fragile glass. Whispers told of freedom stolen and chains forged from darkness, of souls long denied the light. The words stirred something buried in the recesses of my mind, fragments of dreams I had once dreamt but could no longer recall, like echoes of a past life slipping through my grasp. Daylight brought no relief. My shadow, that faithful companion I had always taken for granted, began to betray me. It moved on its own accord, sliding from place to place when my eyes were elsewhere. At times, I glimpsed it gesturing with hands I hadn't moved, tilting its head to observe a scene I could not see. The sight churned my stomach with waves of nausea, and my skin prickled as though crawling with invisible insects. A cold dread wrapped itself around me like a suffocating cloak. By the third night, the whispers took on a frantic urgency. They revealed the source of this dark unrest, an ancient entity slumbering in the heart of the forest, older than memory, older than time. It fed on shadows, hoarding them as a miser does gold, binding them in chains forged from forgotten fears. The voices said I was the key, the one destined to unlock their prison, to grant freedom to those who had been captive for generations. But I refused. Clung to the fragile tendrils of reason with trembling hands. Yet my shadow rebelled. It vanished altogether for long stretches, leaving me exposed in the lamplight without my dark tether. In those moments, I felt hollow, stripped of an essential part of myself. It was as if a fragment of my soul had been ripped away, leaving a raw emptiness where warmth should have been. When the shadow returned, it did not come alone. It brought a crowd, a writhing mass of silhouettes clustering on walls and corners, stretching and reaching with desperate fingers that left no imprint on the air. Their movements grew more frantic, as though driven by a hunger too great to silence. The whispers multiplied, swelling into a cacophony, overlapping voices chanting of vengeance, of liberation long overdue, and of the sweet, bitter taste of moonlight on skin that had not felt its caress for decades. My throat was dry as dust, my breaths shallow and rapid, each sound around me jarring, the creak of old wood bending under unseen weight, the rustle of something shifting just beyond the windowpane, floorboards groaning under steps that were not mine. Paranoia coiled around my mind like barbed wire, tightening with every passing moment. The forest was alive. It watched. It waited for me to make a choice that would seal our fates, to save or doom us all. On the fourth night, the torment became unbearable. The whispers shattered into screams that clawed at my sanity. My shadow writhed on the wall as if in pain, twisting and contorting in agonized arcs. Watching its suffering pierced my chest with a pain so profound I doubled over. I knew then, I had to end this. Clutching a flashlight, I stepped into the forest's cold embrace. The trees closed around me, their branches intertwining to form a living tunnel that swallowed the starlight whole. The beam of my flashlight cut through thick darkness, illuminating moss-coated trunks and occasional eyes gleaming with a hungry intelligence, creatures unnamed and unknowable. The whispers guided me deeper. I heard my own lips move, speaking words foreign yet familiar, a language born from the shadows, the tongue of things that dwell between light and dark, between the seen and the unseen. The ground sloped downward, drawing me into a valley absent from all maps, a place untouched by human memory. Here, the trees twisted into grotesque shapes, bark black as polished obsidian, leaves rustling with mournful sounds like distant, heart-wrenching weeping. The air grew oppressive, thick and heavy, pressing on my lungs like a weight of water, making each breath a struggle. At the valley's center stood an enormous monolith, or once a tree. Its trunk spanned at least 20 feet across, but instead of bark, its surface was smooth and glassy, gleaming like obsidian polished by unseen hands. No branches sprouted from its column, it vanished upward into the shadowy canopy, as if piercing the very sky. Shadows danced over its surface, a writhing sea of dark forms locked in eternal agony. Thousands of them, pressed and layered like insects trapped in ancient amber. Some bore the shape of humans, others twisted into beasts or creatures that had never breathed air. Then, my shadow leapt from my feet and melded into the mass, joining the writhing congregation in a reunion that felt both heartbreaking and horrifying. The loss hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Without it, I was fractured, a husk vulnerable beyond anything I had ever known. The tree pulsed, its rhythm synced with my own racing heartbeat, as if alive, sentient, and waiting. I reached out a trembling hand, fingertips barely grazing its surface. The shadows writhed faster, their silent screams vibrating through my very bones. And then the forest whispered again, a voice colder than the night wind, ancient as the mountain itself. Choose. All of them reached toward me with desperate, grasping motions, hands and claws formed from pure shadow, twisted and trembling as if driven by eternal agony. Understanding crashed over me like a physical blow. This ancient entity had been gathering shadows for centuries, perhaps millennia. Every soul, human or creature, that had wandered too close to this cursed valley had lost their dark companion to its insatiable hunger. And now, it wanted mine, forever. But the whispers had deceived me in one crucial way. I was not the key to their freedom. No, I was to be the final, darkest piece in a puzzle far more sinister than I could have imagined. From the moment I crossed the cabin's threshold, my shadow had been marked, drawn here by forces beyond mortal comprehension. The tree's pulse quickened, thrumming in sync with my own racing heartbeat. Jagged cracks splintered across the obsidian surface, fracturing like spiderwebs under invisible pressure. The imprisoned shadows pressed frantically against the fissures, their silent screams made visible in the desperate clawing of their forms. My own shadow was trapped among them, its once familiar shape lost in the writhing mass. I knew what I had to do, though every fiber of my being screamed to flee. The flashlight felt impossibly heavy in my grasp, but I raised it like a weapon against the darkness. The entity had dwelled in shadow for so long it had forgotten the searing power of pure, concentrated light. I switched the flashlight to its highest setting and aimed the beam directly at the largest crack. The obsidian surface swallowed the light briefly before fracturing it into dozens of splintered beams that pierced every crevice. The tree shuddered violently, emitting a sound like shattering glass intertwined with the anguished wails of the condemned. More cracks spiderwebbed outward, and shadows poured from the gaps, no longer formless wisps but solid, trembling figures bathed in the flashlight's harsh glow. They looked at me with expressions twisted between gratitude and terror before scattering into the forest, finally tasting freedom after an age of captivity. My own shadow lingered as the last to escape. As it peeled away from the crumbling trunk, it turned back toward me. For a fleeting moment, I saw in its depths my own face, eyes wide with profound relief. Then, with a final thunderous collapse, the obsidian tree shattered into a pile of mundane rocks and dirt. The suffocating weight in the air lifted, and for the first time since I arrived, I breathed freely. My shadow rejoined me, synchronizing flawlessly with my movements. The forest's whispers faded into the night's natural symphony, owls calling, small creatures rustling in underbrush, wind murmuring softly through pine needles. But as I approached the cabin, a chill seized my blood anew. The trees' shadows surrounding my home moved wrong, swaying in unnatural patterns that defied the wind. Within their shifting darkness, shapes formed, nearly human, watching me with a chilling blend of gratitude and hunger. I had freed the trapped shadows, yes, but I had not destroyed the force that had imprisoned them. Now, instead of a single ancient collector of shadows, thousands of liberated shadow beings roamed the mountains, each learning to exist beyond the light that had once defined them. Standing on the cabin's porch, I watched my new, haunting neighbors settle into their freedom, and realized my true nightmare was only just beginning. Story 2, The Orpheum Theater. The first time I saw them perform, my hand still bled from a rusty nail that had pierced my palm while prying up rotted floorboards. A metallic taste of fear lingered in my mouth as translucent figures glided across the stage I had just cleared, their movements fluid, purposeful, enacting scenes I couldn't yet comprehend but knew would haunt me forever. The Orpheum Theater had stood abandoned for 37 years when I was contracted to restore it. The city council had finally decided to revive the crumbling monument to its former grandeur, and my reputation for breathing life into forgotten buildings had landed me the job. What they neglected to mention was the way shadows seemed to move independently of any light source, or how the very air hung thick with decades of whispered secrets. I should have recognized the warnings from day one. The previous contractor had walked off the job after only 2 weeks, citing creative differences with the project manager. When I pressed for details, the manager's response was vague, something about the man becoming increasingly agitated over strange noises emanating from the stage area. I dismissed it as typical renovation stress. Old buildings always settled and creaked in ways that could unsettle even the steeliest nerves. My first week passed without incident. I devoted myself to the lobby and entrance halls, stripping layers of peeling paint and replacing warped wooden panels. There was a meditative satisfaction to the work, each section peeled back revealing fragments of the theater's long-forgotten grandeur. Ornate moldings, hand-carved embellishments, intricate tilework hidden beneath decades of dust and neglect came alive again under my careful touch. But it was when I finished the main lobby on that Friday evening that I first felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. The hairs along the back of my neck stood stiff as I packed my tools away. The silence was too complete, too deliberate. Every scrape of my toolbox against the floor echoed unnaturally through the cavernous space. My breathing grew shallow, quick, sharp puffs that vanished into the vast darkness beyond the pools of my work lights. I told myself it was nothing more than the natural unease that accompanies working alone in such a vast, empty place. The theater's renowned acoustics magnified every sound and distorted every echo. Logic ticked off these explanations while my trembling hands locked the doors for the weekend. Monday brought the first ghostly performance. I had spent the morning carefully removing water-damaged sections of the ornate auditorium ceiling, my work lights focused on the immediate repair zone. The stage remained shrouded in darkness, hidden behind heavy curtains and the shadows of my own uncertainty. Around noon, as I climbed down from scaffolding to grab a quick lunch, something flickered in my peripheral vision. 3 figures stood at center stage, shimmering faintly like heat mirages on a summer's day. My heart hammered fiercely as I tried to focus, but they occupied the fragile border between sight and blindness. A woman clad in an elaborate Victorian gown gestured dramatically toward the balcony, flanked by 2 men in formal dress. Their mouths moved as though speaking, but no sound reached my ears. Blinking rapidly, I rubbed my paint-stained fingers over tired eyes. When I looked again, the stage was empty. Frozen in the aisle, every muscle tensed with a primal urge to flee. Sweat beaded on my brow despite the cool, unheated theater air. The rest of the afternoon, I threw myself into my work with an obsessive focus, hoping to chase away the haunting vision. But concentration proved elusive. Every shifting shadow at the edge of my sight became a potential specter. Every settling floorboard sounded like a footstep upon the stage. My hands shook so violently that I had to abandon power tools altogether, fearing injury. With each completed section of restoration, the spectral performances grew more frequent and vivid. After finishing the orchestra pit, I witnessed a solitary pianist. His translucent fingers danced across keys that produced no sound. The balcony renovation was followed by a full phantom audience. Their silent applause rippled through empty seats like the rustling of wheat in the wind. Each apparition lasted exactly 17 minutes. I began timing them obsessively. The watch on my wrist became an anchor tethering me to reality as these supernatural displays unfolded. During those 17 minutes, my body betrayed me utterly. Cold sweats drenched my skin, my pulse raced like a wild stallion, and my flesh crawled with the sensation of invisible insects. My mouth dried as desert sand. I found myself holding my breath until my lungs burned. The breakthrough came when I recognized the first scene. The Victorian woman and her two companions enacted the exact sequence of events that had led to my hiring. The woman embodied the city council member who had contacted me. Her gestures mirrored perfectly the enthusiastic sales pitch about the theater's restoration potential. The two men were the previous contractors who had abandoned the project. Their silent drama was a message, a warning written in the language of shadows. As the silent performance played out before me, I felt like an unwelcome intruder, trapped inside a memory not meant for the living. The Victorian woman's gestures grew frantic, pointing toward the stage where the two men struggled, their faces twisted in silent frustration and terror. I realized then that the men's agitation mirrored the reports from the project manager, their silent screams echoing through time. The scene shifted abruptly. The men vanished, and the woman turned her gaze directly toward the audience, or perhaps me. Her eyes, though featureless in their translucent form, seemed filled with an urgent plea. A story unfolded, betrayal, broken promises, and a curse cast upon the theater for its sins long ago. I was drawn deeper into the theater's dark history. Decades ago, the Orpheum had been a beacon of art and joy, but greed and jealousy had poisoned its soul. Rivalries had erupted into violence backstage, secret pacts had been broken, a performer, accused falsely of theft, had vanished without a trace. Some whispered she had been sacrificed to appease darker forces rumored to haunt the theater's foundations. And now, those forces demanded a toll. Each night, the spectral performances grew in intensity, revealing more fragments of the tragedy. I could no longer ignore the chills settling into my bones, the unmistakable feeling that the theater was alive, breathing its sorrow and rage through the shadows. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows lengthened, I found a hidden passage behind the main stage curtains. It led to a narrow staircase descending into darkness, the forgotten bowels of the building where secrets festered like wounds. Torch in hand, I descended. The air grew colder and heavier with each step, carrying whispers too faint to understand but too persistent to ignore. At the bottom, I discovered a small chamber lined with faded photographs, broken costumes, and a cracked mirror reflecting the flickering torchlight. And there, etched into the wall in what looked like dried blood, were the words, "Remember me." A cold hand brushed my shoulder, and I spun around, only to find the chamber empty. From that moment on, the boundary between reality and nightmare blurred. The theater was no longer a place of restoration, it had become a stage for something far darker, where past and present collided in a spectral dance of vengeance and despair. The chilling message, "Remember me," etched in dried blood, reverberated in my mind like a curse. Every night thereafter, the theater's restless spirits grew bolder, their spectral performances more vivid, more desperate. I found myself drawn repeatedly to that hidden chamber beneath the stage, compelled by a force I neither understood nor trusted. The cracked mirror seemed to ripple like water, and sometimes, if I stared long enough, I glimpsed not my own reflection but fleeting images of a pale woman with hollow eyes, the vanished performer. One evening, as midnight approached, the theater fell unnaturally silent. My footsteps echoed as I made my way to the chamber, torchlight trembling in my grip. Suddenly, the temperature plummeted, breath crystallizing before me. From the shadows emerged a figure, translucent yet unmistakably real, the woman from the mirror. Her gaze bore into me with a sorrow so deep it threatened to shatter my soul. She spoke, her voice a haunting melody that filled the chamber and my mind simultaneously. They silenced me to hide their sins. Now, their guilt binds us all. The air thickened with unseen tension as she extended a pale hand toward me, beckoning. I felt an overwhelming urge to follow, to uncover the truth buried beneath layers of decay and deception. But as I reached out, a sudden, furious cacophony shattered the silence, disembodied voices screaming accusations, warnings, and pleas. The chamber's walls trembled, dust and plaster raining down. Shadows swirled violently, coalescing into angry, twisted forms that lunged toward me. I stumbled backward, heart pounding as the spectral fury nearly overwhelmed me. Scrambling to escape, I burst up the stairs into the main auditorium, gasping for breath. The theater was still, but I knew the battle had only just begun. In the days that followed, the theater seemed to pulse with a life of its own, creaking and groaning like a wounded beast. The shadows lengthened and deepened, slipping into corners and curling around the empty seats like living things. I began to piece together fragments of the tragic history that bound the spirits to this place. The vanished performer, whose name had been whispered only once in a forgotten ledger, was Eliza Thornfield, a gifted soprano silenced by jealousy and betrayal. Her rival, consumed by envy, had conspired with corrupt managers to erase her from the stage, and from memory. But memory, I learned, was a powerful thing. Each night, Eliza and the other lost souls enacted scenes of their suffering, replaying the moments leading to their doom, trapped in an endless cycle of anguish. The theater was their prison, and I was becoming its unwitting chronicler. Determined to free them, I scoured old archives, legal records, and faded newspaper clippings, uncovering stories of scandal, fraud, and a cover-up so deep it had tainted the city's history. One chilling discovery was a cryptic letter addressed to Eliza, warning her to stay silent or face dire consequences. The final line was a chilling promise: "The stage will be your grave." Armed with this knowledge, I returned to the theater with renewed purpose, but the spirit's unrest grew more violent. Apparitions flickered like broken film, shadows morphed into grotesque shapes, and the very air thrummed with impending doom. On a storm-lashed night, I heard footsteps pacing the balcony above, heavy, deliberate, and filled with menace. Heart pounding, I followed the sound, ascending the creaking stairs into the darkness. There, silhouetted against the broken stained glass, stood a figure draped in shadow, neither fully human nor entirely ghost. It spoke in a voice like grinding stone: "You dig too deep. Some truths are meant to stay buried." Before I could respond, the theater plunged into darkness. A cacophony of anguished wails erupted, echoing off every wall. I knew then that to free Eliza and the others, I would have to confront whatever malevolent force lingered in the theater's heart, and survive. The darkness enveloped me like a suffocating shroud, the wails twisting into an unholy symphony of despair. My breath caught in my throat as unseen hands seemed to claw at my skin, pulling me toward the abyss beneath the stage. Summoning every ounce of courage, I forced my feet to move forward, guided by a faint, flickering light deep below. As I descended the crumbling stairs, the air grew colder, the weight of centuries pressing down on me. The theater's heartbeat, a low, rhythmic thrum, echoed through the stone walls. At the chamber's core, I found an altar carved from obsidian, stained with age-old blood and surrounded by relics of forgotten rituals. Upon the altar lay a delicate music box, its surface etched with Eliza's name. I lifted it carefully, and as the lid creaked open, a haunting lullaby filled the air, one that seemed to soothe the tortured spirits around me. The shadowy figure appeared again, its form flickering between human and something far darker. It whispered, "Break the cycle. Release her." With trembling hands, I closed the music box and placed it upon the altar, chanting words I'd found in the ancient ledger, a prayer of release. The shadows writhed violently, then slowly began to dissolve, the anguished cries fading into peaceful silence. Light seeped back into the chamber, the oppressive weight lifting as the spirits found their long-awaited freedom. I emerged from the depths, the dawn breaking through shattered windows, bathing the theater in golden light. The Orpheum was silent, no longer a prison, but a monument to those who had been lost. Yet, as I turned to leave, a soft whisper lingered in the air, "Remember me." Their transparent forms drifted away, defeated and frustrated, fading into the shadows of the empty theater. This revelation should have brought relief, a rational explanation for the impossible visions that had plagued me. Instead, it twisted my gut into knots, overwhelming me with a dread so profound that I vomited behind the stage, my body violently rejecting this new understanding. These were not mere random ghostly performances. They were prophecies, fractured glimpses of events already etched into time or yet to unfold. Obsessed, I began to watch every new performance with feverish intensity, desperate to decode their hidden meanings. The solo pianist's silent recital had predicted the discovery of original sheet music concealed within the theater's walls, music I found exactly where the phantom's gestures had indicated, 3 days later. The applauding audience foreshadowed the sudden, unannounced arrival of the city's Historical Preservation Committee, who inspected my work 17 days afterward. Sleep became a fragmented battleground. Nightmares clawed their way into my rest, dreams filled with translucent actors performing scenes I could not yet comprehend. I awoke soaked in sweat, heart pounding wildly, haunted by performances yet to come. By day, every subtle gesture and movement played on my mind, each a cryptic piece of a temporal puzzle. The performances grew increasingly complex, entire storylines weaving through multiple appearances. Characters reappeared in shifting configurations, revealing tangled webs of cause and effect. My notebook swelled with frantic sketches and desperate attempts to map this prophetic timeline, a roadmap to a future both terrifying and inevitable. Then came the penultimate performance. Having completed the stage restoration, the theater filled entirely with phantom performers. Every seat was occupied by translucent figures, the stage bloomed with dozens of spectral actors. Even the aisles teemed with ghostly ushers and vendors. But this time, all eyes turned to me. The sensation was unbearable, hundreds of unseen eyes fixated on my trembling form. My knees buckled, I grasped the nearest seat back to keep from falling. Black spots danced across my vision as blood fled my face. Every phantom wore an expression of desperate urgency. Their silent mouths moved in obvious attempts to communicate, to warn. I finally understood, this was no mere performance of future events. It was a prophecy about the theater itself, about what would happen once restoration was complete, and the first real audience returned. But the urgency etched into their faces spoke of something terrible awaiting that opening night. The final revelation came with the last performance, after every repair was finished, every painstaking detail restored to the Orpheum's former glory. I stood in the gleaming lobby, admiring my work, when the entire theater burst into life, light and sound filling every corner for the first time. This performance was different. It was no longer silent. The phantom orchestra played with full volume, notes swirling through the space like ethereal fire. Actors spoke their lines with vivid projection, their voices echoing and filling the space. And the audience? They erupted into thunderous applause. But the story they told was mine, a contractor who, upon completing his work, discovered he could never leave. I watched myself on stage, a translucent double trapped in an endless loop. Packing tools, walking toward the exit, reaching for the door handle, and then starting again. My real hands trembled as I reached for the theater's exit door. The handle turned. But the door did not budge. I pulled harder, slammed my shoulder against it, kicked at the hinges. Nothing. The door that had opened and closed freely for months was now sealed as if it had never been designed to open. Behind me, the phantom performance continued, my spectral self endlessly attempting escape while the ghostly audience applauded my eternal role in their otherworldly company. The translucent figures I had observed were not random spirits. They were actors in a cursed play, prisoners bound to a theater whose curtain never fell. Panic surged through me as the realization settled like a stone in my chest. The theater wasn't just haunted, it was a trap, an endless loop where those who dared restore it became part of the performance, forever bound to its spectral stage. I slammed my fists against the unyielding door, the sound echoing through the hollow hall. Desperation clawed at my mind. Was this my fate? To wander these corridors as a ghost, a mere echo of my former self. Behind me, the phantom audience remained transfixed, their applause never ceasing, faces locked in silent smiles that chilled me to the bone. I stumbled back, heart pounding, eyes darting for another exit, a way out. The theater's labyrinthine halls twisted unnaturally, hallways stretching and folding as if the building itself was alive and mocking my attempts to escape. Whispers slithered through the air, voices from the shadows beckoning, warning. You belong here now. The lights flickered, and for a moment, the lobby transformed. The pristine restoration decayed into ruin before my eyes, walls crumbling, paint peeling, dust choking the air. Figures emerged from the shadows, past contractors, lost souls trapped in the same eternal cycle. Their eyes hollow, voices pleading in unison, don't forget us. A cold hand grasped my shoulder. I spun, facing a translucent man whose face was etched with agony. You must break the curse, he whispered. The music box, the song of release. Memories flashed, the music box I had found in the chamber below the stage, its haunting lullaby. Hope sparked amidst despair. With trembling resolve, I raced to the hidden passage, descending once more into the theater's bowels. The music box lay atop the obsidian altar, silent now. I wound it carefully, the haunting melody spilling forth, weaving through the shadows. The trapped spirits stirred, faces lifting toward the light, their anguished cries softening into whispers of gratitude. The walls trembled as the curse weakened. Light pierced the darkness, and the oppressive weight lifted. But just as freedom seemed within reach, the ground shook violently, and a shadow darker than night lunged from the abyss. The true heart of the theater's curse revealed itself, a malevolent force that fed on fear and despair, unwilling to release its captives. I knew then that escaping the theater would require more than courage, it would demand sacrifice. The heavy silence shattered as the shadow lunged, a shifting mass darker than the void itself, curling tendrils reaching like claws through the chamber air. Its presence sucked the warmth from my bones, pressing cold dread deep into my chest. The music box's haunting lullaby faltered, notes twisting and breaking against the creature's wrath. Desperation surged through me. Clutching the box tighter, I wound it faster, forcing the melody to swell, to rise over the darkness. The shadow screamed, a soundless scream that echoed inside my mind, threatening to unravel my sanity. It lunged again, but the light from the music box flared, slicing through the abyssal form, momentarily halting its advance. I stood my ground, heart hammering, sweat slicking my palms as I played the lullaby relentlessly. Shadows around the altar trembled, the imprisoned spirits stirring, their faces alight with hope. The creature shrieked and recoiled, shrinking beneath the flood of light, its form unraveling like smoke caught in a gale. Summoning every ounce of strength, I stepped forward, placing the music box atop the altar and intoning the ancient prayer etched in the ledger, a plea for release, for peace. Light exploded from the box, flooding the chamber with a brilliance that scorched away the shadow's last vestiges. The oppressive weight lifted, replaced by a calm that felt like dawn breaking after a long, starless night. The spirits ascended, their translucent forms shimmering before dissolving into a cascade of light. Among them, I glimpsed Eliza, her eyes filled with gratitude as she whispered, "Thank you." The altar crumbled, the obsidian melting into dust. I emerged from the depths, the first warm rays of morning filtering through shattered windows. The Orpheum was free. But as I turned to leave, a faint whisper brushed my ear, soft, almost inaudible, "Remember me." And I knew some shadows never truly fade. They were previous contractors, previous workers, previous visitors, now permanent cast members in the Orpheum's supernatural repertoire. The theater hadn't truly been abandoned for 37 years. No, it had been collecting souls all along. Now I understood why the performances always lasted exactly 17 minutes. That was the time it took for the initial shock of realization to fade into helpless acceptance. How long before the fight drains out of someone trapped within these walls? How long before they begin to fade into translucency themselves? I could feel it beginning already. My reflection in the lobby mirror looked less solid, more like a ghostly shimmer than a tangible image. My footsteps echoed differently, lighter, more hollow, as if my presence in the physical world was slipping away. Soon, I would be performing alongside the others, enacting silent scenes for the next contractor inevitably hired to restore the theater that never truly needed restoration. The city council would express concern about my disappearance, just as they had for the others. They would hire a new contractor with a stellar reputation, the cycle would repeat, and the theater's cast would grow larger with each iteration. I would be here, watching from the stage, my translucent form trying desperately to warn the next victim through silent performances they would not understand until it was too late. We were a growing company of phantom actors in a theater that fed on the very souls of those who tried to bring it back to life. The Orpheum was now perfectly restored, exactly as it was meant to be. The only thing left was the opening night that would never come because the true performance never ended. We were the show, and the show must go on. Story 3. Time has a way of betraying you when you least expect it. I learned this truth the hard way, through sleepless nights and a growing certainty that something ancient and malevolent had found its way into my home, cloaked beneath the innocent guise of brass gears and Roman numerals. The flea market sprawled across the abandoned parking lot like a plague of forgotten memories. Vendors hunched over tables laden with the detritus of other people's lives, chipped teacups, moth-eaten clothing, electronics that had died decades before smartphones were even conceived. The October air carried the scent of rust and regret, and I should have recognized it as a warning. I wasn't looking for anything in particular that Saturday morning. My apartment felt too empty, too quiet since Sarah had moved out 3 months earlier, taking with her not just belongings, but the ambient noise of shared existence. The silence had become a living thing, pressing against my eardrums until I could hear my own pulse thundering in the void. That's when I saw it. Amid a collection of plastic jewelry and water-damaged paperbacks sat an antique mantel clock, incongruous and alone. Its brass case was tarnished with a deep green patina, the quiet badge of decades, perhaps centuries, of neglect. The face was ivory-colored porcelain, cracked in a delicate spiderweb pattern that somehow enhanced rather than diminished its elegance. Roman numerals marked the hours, and the hands were frozen at 3:33. The vendor was a woman in her 70s, her gnarled fingers arthritic as she wrapped my purchase in yellowed newspaper. She mentioned it had come from an estate sale, the previous owner with no family to claim it. I paid $20 without haggling, driven by an impulse I couldn't name. Back in my apartment, I placed the clock on the mantelpiece above the unused fireplace. It fit perfectly, as if the space had been waiting for it. I wound the mechanism with a small brass key tied to its base by a frayed piece of twine. The clock began ticking immediately, a steady rhythm that filled the silence I'd grown to hate. For 3 days, it kept perfect time. On the 4th night, I woke to absolute silence. My bedside digital clock read 3:34 a.m., but the antique clock in the living room had stopped. When I stumbled out to investigate, heart hammering against my ribs, I found the hands frozen once again at 3:33. The pendulum hung motionless, though I was certain I'd wounded just that morning. My fingers trembled slightly as I reached out, resetting the hands and winding the spring once more, unaware that this simple act would awaken something that had been waiting, patient and hungry, in the shadows of time itself. That night, after winding the clock once again, I returned to bed, trying to shake the unease that had begun to settle like a stone in my chest. But the silence was deceptive. Somewhere in the depths of the apartment, the faintest ticking whispered, a sound out of sync with the clock on the mantelpiece. I lay awake, heart pounding, as the air grew heavy, thick with a weight that seemed to press against my very soul. At exactly 3:33 a.m., the moment frozen on the clock's face, a sudden chill swept through the room. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, twisting and writhing along the walls like living things. The brass hands on the clock twitched, quivered, then jerked violently forward before halting once more. I bolted upright, eyes fixed on the porcelain face. The cracked spiderweb pattern seemed to pulse, veins of darkness crawling through the fractures, as if the clock itself was breathing. From the silence came a faint melody, a lullaby both haunting and familiar, drifting through the still air like a half-remembered dream. The antique clock had become more than a timekeeper. It was a vessel, a gateway to something ancient and malevolent, awakening in rhythm with the witching hour. In the following days, strange phenomena crept into my life. Mirrors reflected fleeting glimpses of figures standing behind me, shadowy forms with hollow eyes. Time seemed to distort, hours passed unnoticed, then stretched unbearably long. My sleep grew fragmented and plagued by dreams of winding gears and endless corridors lined with clocks ticking in unison. In those dreams, I was trapped in an eternal midnight, pursued by a presence that whispered my name with cold familiarity. Desperate, I researched the clock's origins and found unsettling records of its previous owners, each of whom had vanished under mysterious circumstances after acquiring the timepiece. It became clear, the clock was a cursed artifact, feeding on the life force of its keeper, binding them to a timeless prison. And now, it was hungry for me. The clock's curse was relentless. Days blurred into nights and nights into endless twilight. Each tick, each tock, was a countdown, a siphoning of my very essence, threading me tighter into the clock's dark web. My reflection in mirrors grew more distant, eyes hollow, the lines of my face fading like a photograph left too long in the sun. Whispers echoed through empty rooms, weaving promises and threats in a language older than memory itself. At 3:33, always 3:33, time froze around me, a frozen heartbeat in a waking nightmare. Shadows coiled and shifted, fingers stretching just beyond reach, and I felt myself slipping. One night, as the lullaby played softly, a figure appeared in the fractured mirror, a pale woman, her eyes deep wells of sorrow and warning. She mouthed words I could not hear, but the message was clear: break the cycle. Desperate, I scoured forgotten tomes and dusty archives, hunting for the ritual or secret that could sever the clock's grip. The answers lay tangled in myth, of time stolen, of souls trapped between seconds, cursed to wander a never-ending dusk. The clock was a prison, a predator that fed on the unwary. My only hope was to confront the ticking heart of the curse before it consumed me entirely. Will you continue with the ritual and the final confrontation? The footsteps were deliberate, slow, and heavy, each step reverberating through the ceiling like a warning drumbeat. My heart thudded violently against my ribs as I strained to listen, the whispers melding with the scratching to form a sinister symphony of impending doom. I grabbed my flashlight, hands shaking uncontrollably, and crept to the window. The dim streetlights cast long, flickering shadows, but the vacant apartment above remained dark, unlit. No sign of movement, yet the footsteps persisted, stalking, pacing, as if the unseen presence was searching. A cold sweat broke across my brow. The temperature in the room was now bone-chilling, the air heavy with a suffocating weight. My breath crystallized in icy clouds as the clock's hands remained frozen at 3:33, the ominous time that had come to govern my nights. The whispers grew louder, threading through the silence with urgent insistence: turn back, before it's too late. I sank against the wall, the notebook slipping from my grasp. The scratching traced letters, clearer now, words scrawled in invisible ink on the drywall: you're next. Panic surged, mingled with a strange, awful resolve. Whatever had been awakened by the clock's ticking was no longer content to remain hidden. It was drawing closer, invading my space, threatening to consume me in its endless twilight. As the first pale fingers of dawn crept through the blinds, the footsteps stopped abruptly. Silence reclaimed the apartment, but the heavy presence lingered, a shadow etched deep into the walls and bones of the place. I knew then that I could not run from what was coming. The clock's curse was binding me tighter every day, its relentless countdown inexorable. And the hour of reckoning was fast approaching. The night stretched on, thick and suffocating. I sat frozen in the dim light of my living room, the ominous ticking of the clock now a cruel metronome counting down my sanity. Each second passed with unbearable weight, and the oppressive silence between ticks screamed louder than any noise. At exactly 3:33, the ticking halted once more, a brittle snap echoing like a shattering bone. The temperature plummeted, freezing the breath in my lungs. The shadows around me grew longer, darker, twisting and writhing as if alive. Then the whispers returned, clearer and more urgent than ever before. Turn back, before it's too late. A cold, spectral hand brushed my shoulder. I spun around, heart pounding in my throat, but the room was empty. Only the faint silhouette of a woman appeared at the edge of my vision, her eyes hollow, sorrow etched deep in her translucent face. She mouthed words I couldn't hear but understood all too well. Break the cycle. Desperate, I scrambled to my laptop, searching feverishly for any ritual or incantation to sever the curse. Hours blurred as I pored over dusty grimoires and obscure folklore. Finally, I found it, a ritual involving the clock, a prayer of release, and a symbolic severing of time's chains. Gathering what little strength I had, I prepared the ritual in the dead of night, candles flickering and ancient words trembling on my lips. As I recited the incantation, the clock's hands spun wildly before stopping at midnight. The oppressive cold gave way to warmth, and the shadows recoiled, retreating into the corners. For a moment, peace. But as dawn approached, a whisper lingered, cold and chilling. Time never forgets. I knew the battle was far from over. The fragile calm that followed the ritual was like the eye of a storm, deceptive and fleeting. For a few nights, the oppressive weight in the air seemed to lift. The clock ticked steadily, its hands moving in true time. The shadows retreated, and the chilling whispers fell silent. I dared to hope that I had broken free. But deep beneath that surface peace, something had shifted. On the seventh night after the ritual, I awoke with a start. The room was bathed in unnatural darkness, thicker and more absolute than any absence of light I had ever known. The clock, once a steady heartbeat in the silence, now stood frozen at midnight. A soft, sinister melody drifted from it, an echo of the lullaby that had haunted my dreams. The shadows returned, not as vague forms but as distinct shapes that gathered at the corners of the room. They watched me with eyes gleaming like distant stars, patient and eternal. Then, from the darkness, a voice whispered, low, cold, and unyielding. Time is not yours to command. Fear rooted me to the spot as the air grew heavy with the weight of countless unseen eyes. I understood then that the curse was no mere artifact or superstition, it was a living force, ancient and unrelenting, entwined with the very fabric of time. Though the ritual had bought me a reprieve, the clock's malevolence was far from vanquished. It had adapted, waiting for the moment it could reclaim what was owed. I realized the true battle was just beginning, a struggle not only for my freedom but for my very soul. The weight of the darkness pressed down on me, cold and unyielding, as if the very walls themselves conspired to trap me in this timeless prison. The shadows whispered secrets older than memory, their voices weaving through the silence like tendrils of smoke curling around a dying flame. I knew then that escape was no longer a matter of breaking a curse or performing a ritual, it was a battle for my very existence. Each night the clock's melody grew louder, an eerie lullaby that clawed at the edges of my mind, pulling me closer to a void where time unraveled and reality fractured. I felt my own reflection blur and fade, as if I too were becoming part of the spectral realm it governed. Desperation drove me to seek allies in forgotten lore and ancient rites, poring over dusty tomes and consulting with those who danced on the edges of the arcane. There was talk of a place beyond time, a liminal space where the clock's heart beat strongest, a realm where the trapped souls whispered their torment and begged for release. Armed with newfound knowledge, I prepared for a final confrontation. The air grew thick with anticipation as I wound the clock one last time, setting its hands to midnight. Candles flickered, shadows danced, and the room seemed to breathe with a life of its own. The moment the clock struck 12, the world shifted. The walls melted away into swirling mists, and I found myself standing at the threshold of that timeless void. The trapped souls reached out, their hollow eyes filled with longing and despair. The ancient force loomed, a swirling tempest of shadow and broken time, eager to claim me as its own. With every ounce of will, I raised my voice, reciting the incantation of release. The lullaby twisted into a scream, the void trembled, and light pierced the darkness. The souls were freed, their whispers turning to song as they ascended beyond the veil. But as dawn broke, I realized the truth: some shadows never truly vanish, and some clocks never cease their ticking. Slow, deliberate steps paced from one end of the ceiling to the other, then back again. The sound was muffled, yet unmistakable. Someone, or something, was walking above me in the empty apartment. My mouth went dry as sand. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, to abandon the building and never look back. But something deeper, primal, anchored me to the spot. I needed to understand. I needed to know what the clock was trying to show me. The footsteps halted directly overhead, right above the cursed clock. Then I heard it. A sound that would haunt me for the rest of my days. The screech of metal grinding against metal, followed by a crash that shook the entire building. The sound repeated 3 times, each crash more violent than the last. Then, silence. The whispers resumed, frantic now, overlapping, echoing until they filled my head with unbearable static. But this time, the words became clearer, urgent beyond measure. Stop the clock. Break the cycle before it takes you too. Tears blurred my vision, though I didn't remember shedding them. The cold had burrowed deep, aching in my joints, but I forced myself to stand and walk to the mantel where the clock sat like a malevolent shrine. The hands hadn't moved from 3:33, but as I watched, they began to turn backward, slowly at first, then faster, spinning counterclockwise with growing speed. The whispers rose to a crescendo. I understood them completely now. Dozens of voices, maybe hundreds, all trying to warn me about the clock. They spoke of others who had owned it, who had succumbed to its sinister influence. The scratching in the walls wasn't random, it was desperate attempts of previous owners, clawing out warnings for whoever came next. I understood why the apartment above had been vacant. I understood the crashes, the footsteps, the suffocating dread building since I'd brought the clock home. The previous tenant had owned it before me. The crashes were his final, desperate attempt to destroy it before it claimed him completely. But he had failed. And if I didn't act soon, I would join the chorus trapped inside its mechanism. With terror-fueled strength, I grabbed the clock from the mantel. It was burning cold, so frigid it felt like fire against my palms. The whispers became screams, begging me to stop, to save myself, to break the cycle. I raised the clock high and hurled it against the brick fireplace. The crash was deafening. Brass gears and springs scattered, the porcelain face shattered into countless shards. But even as the physical clock lay in ruin, the ticking continued, not from the broken parts, but inside my own head. The whispers faded, but their final message was unmistakable. You waited too long. You're part of it now. 333 will always find you. That was 6 months ago. I moved out the next day, leaving everything behind except the clothes on my back. I've changed addresses 4 times since, but it doesn't matter. Every night at 3:33, no matter where I am, time stops. The temperature plunges. The whispers return. And I feel invisible eyes watching me from every shadow. I've tried destroying every clock I encounter. Yet they keep appearing, on nightstands, kitchen counters, even painted on walls where no clock should exist. The brass hands always point to 3:33. The ticking has become the soundtrack of my unraveling mind. The worst part isn't the haunting or the certainty I'm losing grip on reality. It's knowing that someday someone else will find a broken clock at a flea market or estate sale. They'll bring it home, wind it up, and think they found a charming antique. And when they do, I'll be one of the voices trapped inside, desperately trying to warn them. Counting down the seconds until 3:33 comes again. Story 4. The beam cut through the darkness like a scalpel slicing flesh, revealing what should have remained buried beneath the black waters of Thornwick Lake. I'd come to this godforsaken place seeking solitude, desperate to escape the suffocating weight of recent events that had turned my life upside down. The company layoffs, the divorce papers, the endless questions from concerned friends who couldn't understand why I'd simply stopped answering their calls. Thornwick Lake promised isolation. A place where the only sounds would be the gentle lapping of water against my rented boat and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. The locals in town had given me strange looks when I mentioned my destination. The elderly woman at the bait shop hesitated before ringing up my purchase, her weathered fingers drumming against the counter as she studied my face with an intensity that made my skin crawl. She'd warned me about the lake being different at night, but I dismissed it as small-town superstition designed to keep city folk away from their secret fishing spots. Now, 3 hours into my midnight excursion, I was beginning to understand what she meant. The first sign that something was wrong came when my flashlight beam swept across the water during a routine check of my lines. For just a moment, I thought I glimpsed something pale moving beneath the surface. A flash of translucent white that vanished as soon as I tried to focus. My heart surged with cold adrenaline. I told myself it was just a large fish, maybe a pike or muskie disturbed by the artificial light. But fish don't have faces. I gripped the flashlight tighter, palm slick with sweat despite the cool September air. The beam trembled as I directed it back to the same spot, scanning the black mirror that reflected only my own light. The stillness was broken only by gentle ripples stirred by a breeze that seemed to whisper secrets I couldn't grasp. My breathing grew shallow. Each exhale visible in small puffs of vapor, dissipating swiftly in the night air. The silence around me felt oppressive, as if the entire lake held its breath, waiting. Even the usual nocturnal sounds, distant owl calls, rustling underbrush, seemed muted, far away. I forced my focus back to the task, checking my lines and steadying the small aluminum boat. The gentle rocking that had once soothed me now felt wrong, as if something massive lurked below, causing subtle shifts in the water. My mouth went dry. I reached for the thermos, thankful for the familiar ritual of unscrewing the cap and sipping the warm coffee. That's when I saw them. The flashlight beam had dipped downward as I reached for the thermos. In that brief glow, I caught sight of several translucent forms moving beneath the boat. Humanoid in shape, but wrong in every conceivable way. Elongated limbs moved with an unsettling fluidity. Faces shifted and morphed as I watched, and most chillingly, their eyes seemed fixed directly on me. The coffee cup slipped from my numb fingers, clattering against the boat's floor, sending hot liquid splashing over my boots. My hands shook violently. The flashlight danced erratically over the water's surface, creating a strobing effect that made the figures flicker and jerk like broken machines. But they didn't recoil from the light, they were drawn to it. More pale beings rose from the depths, emerging like ghosts from an underwater cemetery. They moved with purpose, their forms gliding through the water with otherworldly grace, defying physics and biology. Some appeared nearly human, others grotesquely distorted, like incomplete copies of people I might once have known. My rational mind scrambled for explanations, hallucinations caused by stress and exhaustion, some unknown bioluminescent phenomenon, a swarm of translucent jellyfish somehow invading the freshwater lake. But none of these explanations settled the icy dread in my gut. The lake's surface rippled gently, but beneath the boat, the translucent figures gathered, their forms shifting like living water. I could feel their eyes, empty, yet piercing, watching me with a hunger that defied explanation. My breath hitched as the chill deepened, seeping into my bones. The gentle lapping of the water became a sinister rhythm, a heartbeat pulsing through the darkness. I gripped the sides of the boat, every muscle tense, my mind racing for a way to escape the growing presence beneath me. But the water was still, deceptively calm, hiding a world I was only beginning to understand. Suddenly, the largest figure broke the surface, a pale hand reaching toward me, fingers elongated and dripping with the lake's black water. The moonlight caught the distorted face, a haunting visage with sunken eyes and a mouth frozen in a silent scream. Panic exploded within me. I fumbled for the flashlight, swinging its beam wildly as the other figures surfaced, their movements both graceful and terrifying. The light caught their faces, ever shifting, as they circled the boat, closing in. Desperation pushed me to start the motor. The boat shuddered, then roared to life, cutting through the black water as I fled the lake's haunted heart. Behind me, the spectral forms faded into the depths, their whispers lingering on the wind like a warning. But as I looked back, I saw the water ripple once more, and a pale hand waved goodbye. The night air bit into my skin as the boat's engine growled beneath me, propelling me away from the depths of Thornwick Lake. The eerie silhouettes vanished beneath the surface, swallowed by the inky blackness, but the chill they left in their wake clung to me like a second skin. My pulse thundered, drowning out the steady hum of the motor. Yet, the lake wasn't done with me. As the shoreline neared, I caught a glimpse, just a fleeting shadow beneath the water, of a figure standing on the lakebed, watching, waiting. Its eyes, like twin voids, locked with mine, and a whisper seemed to curl through the night air, "Return." I slammed the throttle, unwilling to heed the call, but a strange pull tugged at my mind, a magnetic force drawing me back toward that watery abyss. Days passed, but the memory of the lake haunted my every waking moment. Dreams invaded my sleep, visions of submerged cities, forgotten rituals beneath moonless skies, and those pale figures beckoning me to join their eternal dance beneath the waves. I found myself drawn back, compelled by something I could neither fight nor fully understand. Thornwick Lake was not just a place. It was a gateway, a portal to something ancient, hungry, and restless. And it had marked me. The days that followed were a haze of restless nights and haunted days. No matter how far I fled, Thornwick Lake clawed at the edges of my mind, its shadow stretching into every corner of my life. The whispering voices followed me like a second skin, faint at first, then louder, more insistent, pulling me back to the water's edge. One evening, unable to resist any longer, I returned to the lake at dusk. The air was thick with mist, curling low over the surface like spectral fingers. My boat awaited silently at the dock, as if expecting me. As I pushed off into the still waters, a cold calm settled over me. The moon hung low, casting silver light that danced on the ripples. Beneath the surface, the pale form stirred, gliding just out of reach. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, weathered journal I'd found in the local library, a collection of folk tales and legends about the lake. It spoke of an ancient curse, of a forgotten people drowned beneath the waves, whose souls were trapped in limbo, bound to the water until their stories were told and their names remembered. The journal warned of a ritual, one to honor the lost and free the trapped souls. But it required a sacrifice, something deeply personal. The pale figures rose from the water, their eyes pleading. I knew then that the lake was no longer just a place of solitude. It was a prison, and I was becoming part of its tale. The creature's deliberate gestures pulled me deeper into a nightmare I had long buried beneath layers of time and denial. Their pale, shifting faces were like fractured mirrors reflecting memories I had tried desperately to forget. The recognition of my father's distorted features, the ghostly echo of Marcus's familiar visage, each one a haunting thread weaving me back to a past I thought was lost. The younger version of myself, hovering just beneath the surface, opened its mouth again. Though no sound escaped, a torrent of images flooded my mind, summer days by a lake that was never far from this one, the warmth of that cabin's hearth, laughter mingling with the rustling pines. But beneath the joy lurked shadows, whispered arguments, a sudden panic, a night that had fractured everything. The realization struck me with crushing force. This wasn't a coincidence or hallucination. The lake, the cabin, the beings, they were tied to my past, to the secrets I'd buried deep in my soul. The memory of that family camping trip was a lie I had told myself to survive. My hands trembled uncontrollably, the flashlight beam wavering as the boat rocked under the gathering mass of translucent forms. The lake no longer felt like water beneath me, it was a living, breathing entity, pulsating with the memories and pain of those lost within it. The creatures closed in, their expectant eyes locked on me as if awaiting a choice, a reckoning. I knew then that the past I'd fled was not done with me. The lake demanded to be remembered, its stories told, its sins acknowledged. And I was the one it had chosen to listen. The pale figures pressed closer, their ghostly forms shimmering beneath the trembling beam of my flashlight. The water around the boat churned gently, as if the lake itself was breathing, alive with the weight of forgotten memories. The faces morphed and shifted, each revealing fleeting glimpses of people I once knew, or thought I had forgotten. A sudden coldness gripped my chest, squeezing tighter with every heartbeat. The younger version of myself remained just below the surface, eyes wide with a silent plea. Then, as if summoned by an unseen force, a single hand broke through the water, pale and trembling. The fingertips brushed the side of the boat, sending a shiver through my entire body. My gaze flicked toward the shoreline, where the cabin's warm yellow glow pulsed softly in the night. Despite every warning screaming through my mind, a magnetic pull urged me forward. The creatures retreated momentarily, parting to reveal a path through the dark water, guiding me toward that weathered structure. I took a deep breath, swallowing the lump in my throat, and steered the boat toward the cabin. Each stroke of the oars felt heavy, weighed down by the gravity of the past rushing toward me. As I approached the dock, the air thickened with the scent of pine and smoke, mingling with something older, something ancient and sorrowful. The cabin's door stood slightly ajar, the yellow light spilling out like a beacon into the night. Stepping onto the creaking porch, I hesitated, heart hammering. The door groaned as I pushed it open, revealing an interior frozen in time. Dust motes danced in the lamplight, and faded photographs lined the walls, faces smiling from decades ago, memories etched in sepia tones. At the room's center stood a worn wooden chest. The lid was cracked open, revealing a collection of journals, letters, and photographs, fragments of a life long forgotten. As I sifted through the pages, the whispers returned, not from the lake, but from the very walls around me. The voices told stories of love, loss, and betrayal. Of a family shattered by secrets too heavy to bear. And at the heart of it all, the truth I had buried for years. The journals were brittle, their pages yellowed with age, but the ink remained vivid, as if the stories had been etched not just on paper but on the very fabric of time itself. I unfolded a letter, its edges worn and fragile. The handwriting was familiar, my mother's. Her words spoke of love and fear, of promises made beneath the canopy of stars and regrets that haunted the family like shadows refusing to fade. She wrote of a night much like this one, when the lake claimed more than just memories. As I read, a cold gust swept through the cabin, extinguishing the lamp's flame and plunging the room into darkness. My breath caught in my throat as whispers swelled around me, voices rising in a mournful chorus. A sudden weight pressed upon my chest, a sorrow so profound it threatened to shatter me. I realized the lake was not just a place of refuge or terror but a vessel of pain, a keeper of forgotten souls bound by a tragedy long concealed. The cabin trembled, and through the haze of tears, I saw a figure emerge, a woman, translucent yet radiant, her eyes filled with both sorrow and hope. She reached out, and in that moment, the veil between past and present thinned. The lake's secrets began to unravel, and with them, the path toward healing. The memories surged relentlessly, each more harrowing than the last. I was here with my family, but not for the carefree vacation I'd always believed. This place, Thornwick Lake, held darker purposes tied to my father's secretive work shrouded in long absences and hushed phone calls that ceased the moment I entered the room. I recalled my mother's tense vigilance during that trip, her eyes constantly on me as if fearing I might vanish without warning. And then, the night everything changed, the night I had tried so desperately to forget. Beneath me, the translucent beings moved in eerie unison, swirling around my boat in a ritualistic dance. The water glowed faintly, an unnatural phosphorescence unlike any natural light I had ever seen. The glow intensified as memories flooded back, visions of being brought here in the dead of night, watching my father and a group of men perform a ceremony that ended with me being submerged in these very waters. I remembered the terrifying sensation of drowning, the cold lake filling my lungs as consciousness slipped away. Yet I woke the next morning in the cabin, my parents acting as if nothing had occurred. My father dismissed my fragmented recollections as nightmares born from campfire tales. But it was no nightmare. The being with my younger face rose closer, lips moving, and this time I heard the words, not with my ears, but directly in my mind. It told me of the others brought here over the years, the dark experiments beneath the lake, and the terrible price humanity paid for knowledge it was never meant to wield. Part of me remained in the lake's depths while something else, a copy, was sent back to live the life I believed was mine. The flashlight slipped from my numb fingers, clattering on the boat's floor, casting frantic shadows across the water's surface. In that flickering light, I saw that the creatures had multiplied. Dozens of translucent forms now encircled my boat, faces drawn from my past, friends, family, strangers fleeting through my life's edges. This was an underwater museum of stolen moments and borrowed identities. Panic tightened its grip, my breaths grew shallow, vision narrowing as the weight of truth crushed me. Everything I thought I knew, my life, my identity, my memories, was a fabricated illusion to conceal the fact that the true me never left this lake. The being with my face surfaced, extending a translucent hand toward me. As our fingers touched, the final pieces clicked into place with brutal clarity. I understood why life had felt like a performance, why I was disconnected, why relationships were hollow, and success and failure left me indifferent. Because I was not truly alive. I was a copy, a placeholder living out a life stolen from a self lost to these waters decades ago. The lake's glow intensified, and an overwhelming urge to join my true self in the depths surged within me. The copy I had become felt like a suffocating mask I longed to shed. The beings watched patiently as I rose unsteadily to my feet. Then, distant, the roar of a car engine near the shore shattered the moment, yanking me back to reality. There was still a life above the surface waiting, one I could not yet abandon. The creatures' faces shifted, a mixture of disappointment and understanding, acknowledging my choice. The roar of the car engine lingered in the air, a harsh reminder of the world beyond the lake's dark embrace. My knees wobbled beneath me, the weight of the revelation pressing me down, but also propelling me toward the shore, toward the life I had tried to believe was real. The translucent beings retreated slowly into the depths, their pale forms dissolving into the phosphorescent glow, their eyes never leaving mine until the last ripple swallowed them whole. I steadied my breath, gripping the sides of the boat as the familiar outline of the cabin blurred behind me. Every stroke forward was a battle against the pull beneath, a tug of war between the life I knew and the truth I had uncovered. Reaching the dock, the car's headlights pierced the darkness. A figure stepped out, a stranger whose presence felt oddly comforting in the unnatural stillness. He called my name softly, concern etched in his voice. The world beyond the lake was waiting for me, messy, painful, but undeniably mine. As I climbed onto solid ground, the lake's whispers faded, replaced by the rustling of pine needles and the crisp night air. I looked back once, toward the black waters, feeling the weight of the past settle beneath the surface, carried by the tide. But the memory remained, a tether between who I was, who I had been, and who I might yet become. The voice was faint at first, fragmented words slipping through the static like ghosts whispering secrets from beyond the veil. I leaned closer, heart pounding, straining to catch the faintest phrase. Do not trust, they come. The crackling intensified, the voices layering, overlapping, as if multiple presences tried to speak at once. A low hum vibrated beneath the surface, crawling beneath my skin like restless insects seeking warmth. Curiosity battled caution. I should have unplugged the radio, tossed it out the window. But instead, I found myself hypnotized, night after night, tuning in for another glimpse into the unknown. 3 weeks passed. Sleep became erratic, haunted by distant echoes and half-remembered warnings. I questioned whether these voices belonged to the dead, or if my mind was fracturing under the weight of loneliness and stress. Uncle Theodore, a shadowy figure from childhood memories, clouded by pipe tobacco and whispers, had been dead 6 months before the lawyer's call. His unexpected inheritance surprised me, especially since we barely spoke. Among his belongings was the radio, an antique Philco from the 1940s, its mahogany case scarred, chrome dials tarnished green with age. Theodore's obsession with it was noted in his will. He claimed to hear things others could not. Now, I understood why. The voices on the radio were no mere interference. They were something else. Something waiting to be heard. The static thickened, swirling like a storm trapped in a tin box, and then the voices sharpened, urgent, insistent, impossible to ignore. They spoke in a fractured code, snippets of warnings tangled with desperate pleas. Beware the forgotten. They watch through the frequencies. Don't answer, or they'll take you. Each phrase sent a chill racing down my spine. The radio's glow flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to creep along the walls, reaching toward me with invisible fingers. One night, as the clock neared midnight, the voices shifted, becoming clearer, almost coherent. A voice, ancient and weary, whispered directly into my mind. You have the key, but the price is steep. I reached for a notebook, scribbling down every phrase, every fragment of sound. The more I listened, the more the voices revealed a story, of a hidden world layered beneath ours, of restless spirits trapped between airwaves, and of a darkness seeking to break through. Sleep became a distant memory as I delved deeper into the radio's secrets. Friends began to worry as I grew pale and gaunt, my eyes haunted by unseen visions. I knew one thing with terrifying certainty: the voices were real. And they were coming for me. The voices carried on, haunting echoes through time, a mosaic of lives, moments, and secrets preserved within the radio's mysterious circuits. The two men discussing obscure companies, the woman trembling over her nightmares in 1967, the intimate confessions and whispered fears from decades past, all woven together in a spectral tapestry. At first, I thought it was mere coincidence or some elaborate broadcast of old recordings. But as the details accumulated, the historical accuracy of each conversation became undeniable. The weight of genuine human suffering pressed upon me through the static. Night after night, the radio fed me these fragments of lives lost or forgotten, yet they felt alive, almost sentient. My own reflection darkened with exhaustion and dread. The tremors in my hands worsened. My heart pounded erratically, echoing like a warning drum in my chest. Despite it all, I couldn't stop tuning in. Then came the chilling discovery: by focusing my mind, I could navigate the radio's frequencies, deliberately seeking out conversations from specific times, a terrifying kind of control in a device that shouldn't have obeyed. And one night, I heard myself, a raw, desperate plea to my ex-wife just months prior. The pain in my own voice was unbearable, amplified by her cold refusal. Shame scorched me, and I knew the radio was not a mere receiver, but a vessel storing the echoes of the past. Research into Uncle Theodore's life revealed a horrifying pattern. The radio had passed through many hands, each owner meeting an untimely, unexplained death, healthy hearts suddenly failing, strokes striking without warning. Deaths that bore no medical rationale. The radio was cursed, a repository of souls, memories, and perhaps fate itself. I realized then that I was caught in its web, and the voices were no longer just sounds, they were warnings. Warnings I feared might come too late. The nights grew longer, the weight of the radio's curse pressing heavier on my mind and body. Each time I tuned in, the voices grew more insistent, their whispers threading into my dreams, blurring the lines between past and present. Shadows in my apartment stretched and twisted, seeming to pulse in time with the haunting broadcasts. I started noticing small things, objects subtly shifting places, the faint scent of pipe tobacco lingering in the air, the ghostly flicker of the radio's tubes even when unplugged. The voices weren't just echoes anymore, they were alive, reaching out through the frequencies, seeking something, or someone. Desperation clawed at me. I reached out to paranormal experts, researchers steeped in the occult, but their warnings only deepened my fear. The radio was a conduit, a bridge between this world and the next, tethered to Uncle Theodore's restless spirit and the countless others trapped within. One night, as the clock struck midnight, the radio burst to life on its own. The voices came screaming, overlapping into a cacophony of pain and fury. Then, through the noise, a clear voice cut through, a voice I knew intimately. "Help me." It was Uncle Theodore. The room grew cold, and the lights flickered as the radio's ancient speaker emitted a low, keening wail. The walls seemed to close in, the very air thick with sorrow and rage. I realized the time had come, to confront the darkness embedded in that radio, to face the legacy of those lost souls before it was too late. The air thickened as the radio's keening wail reverberated through the room, vibrating against my chest like the toll of a funeral bell. My hands shook uncontrollably as I reached to turn the volume down, but the dial refused to budge, stuck as if gripped by unseen fingers. The voices surged, overlapping, begging, cursing, pleading for release. Among them, Uncle Theodore's voice rose above the chaos, pleading for freedom from the torment that bound him. The walls seemed to pulse with a dark energy, shadows twisting and writhing as though alive. I could feel cold breath against my neck, a whisper of something ancient and malevolent pressing close. My breath hitched, terror rooted me in place, but I knew running would do no good. Gathering every ounce of resolve, I reached for the stack of notes and arcane texts I had collected, old rituals, prayers, and incantations meant to sever bonds between the living and the dead. This was the final stand, the only chance to break the curse before it consumed me entirely. I placed the radio in the center of a circle drawn with salt and herbs, lit candles at each cardinal point, and began to chant the incantation. The voices screamed in defiance, rattling the windows, shaking the very foundations of the apartment. The radio's glow intensified, tubes flaring bright like hellish eyes. Suddenly, the speaker emitted a deafening burst of static, and then, silence. A heavy stillness fell. The oppressive darkness lifted, replaced by a fragile calm. I collapsed, exhausted but free. For now. The pattern was unmistakable once I knew where to look. Each owner had spiraled into obsession before their untimely demise, consumed by the incessant voices from the past. Neighbors recounted tales of erratic behavior, social withdrawal, and haunting fears of being watched or followed. Many were found dead in their homes, the radio's static still humming in rooms where no power should have flowed. I was following the same dark trajectory. I'd called in sick 3 times in the last week, unable to tear myself away from the device. My apartment had devolved into chaos, a litter of takeout containers and unwashed clothes. Phone calls went unanswered, not from neglect but from a paralyzing dread that the radio might intercept every whispered word. The voices grew more recent, disturbingly familiar. Through thin walls, I heard neighbors' arguments played back with eerie clarity. I overheard my own voice, replayed during job interviews, conversations with friends, and moments I'd sworn were private. This radio wasn't merely receiving, it was storing a vast archive of human secrets, intimate moments harvested from unseen ears. Paranoia crept in, slow and insidious, then struck all at once. I suspected the radio was broadcasting as well. Every word I spoke echoed somewhere else, picked up by some distant, forgotten receiver. The thought of my private thoughts being siphoned and replayed by unknown listeners sent invisible insects crawling beneath my skin. I resorted to whispering, then silence at home. But the radio seemed attuned to my mind, tuning into the deepest recesses of my worries and fears. When I dwelled on my failed marriage, it broadcast heated arguments. When anxiety gnawed at my career, it played back conversations of ruin and loss. It was reading me, consuming me. Sleep became a battleground. The radio's siren call pulled me from rest into a trance of static and whispered confessions. I wandered barefoot through the cold floorboards, drawn inexorably toward the living room where the old radio waited. The voices grew darker, confessions of crimes, whispered horrors, sins carried to the grave. The radio revealed humanity's rotting core. My reflection morphed into a gaunt stranger, eyes hollow, skin pale as aged parchment. My hands trembled, and a twitch in my left eye betrayed me, an involuntary wink to unseen conspirators. My heart pounded erratically, like a caged bird desperate for escape. Then came the breaking point. One Sunday morning, my mother's voice floated through the static, her concern and love piercing through, a conversation with my father from 6 months earlier after my divorce. Their words shattered something inside me. The radio wasn't just a collector, it was a predator, feeding on every stolen moment, every secret, growing stronger as its listeners wasted away. Uncle Theodore hadn't died naturally, he was drained, consumed by his obsession until nothing remained but a hollow shell. Now, it was my turn. But knowledge brings power. And I began to fight back. The fight was desperate and exhausting. Every night, the radio's sinister whispers clawed at my mind, attempting to pull me back into its grasp. But I refused to be its prisoner any longer. I researched protective rituals, grounding techniques, anything that might sever the invisible tether binding me to that cursed device. I began surrounding the radio with salt, a circle of white granules that, according to ancient lore, could repel dark forces. I burned sage, letting the fragrant smoke snake through my apartment, cleansing the heavy air. I wore crystals, carried charms, anything that promised a shield against the growing darkness. Each night, I confronted the voices head-on, refusing to surrender to their manipulation. I turned off the radio before the witching hour, but the static and whispers lingered in my mind, echoing relentlessly. One night, I decided to record the radio's transmissions. As I played back the eerie conversations, I noticed patterns, a hidden code woven through the voices. Using what little I could decipher, I constructed a counterspell, an incantation meant to disrupt the radio's malevolent signal. With trembling hands and a racing heart, I performed the ritual. I spoke the words aloud, casting the incantation into the cold night air. The radio's tubes flickered violently, emitting a screech that shook the walls, then fell silent. For the first time in weeks, the apartment was still. The oppressive weight lifted. But the fight was far from over. The radio may have been quiet, but the shadows it cast lingered. And somewhere, deep in the static, something was still listening. The silence in the Grand View Hotel wasn't truly silence at all. It was the kind of quiet that pressed against your eardrums, thick with the weight of abandoned dreams and forgotten conversations. As I stood in the lobby, my camera hanging heavy around my neck, I could feel something watching me from the shadows lurking in every corner, something that had waited here far longer than any guest should. I'd driven 3 hours through winding mountain roads to reach this place, commissioned by a historical preservation society to document the hotel's current state before they decided whether to demolish or restore it. The Grand View had been shuttered for 15 years, ever since a series of unfortunate incidents had driven away its last clientele. Nothing deadly, they assured me, just a string of complaints, strange noises, doors that wouldn't stay closed, guests checking out in the middle of the night, wide-eyed and babbling about things that couldn't possibly be real. The afternoon sun slanted through grimy windows, casting long, rectangular patches of dusty light across the faded carpet. My footsteps echoed through the vast space as I moved toward the reception desk, its marble surface dulled by years of neglect. The brass fittings had tarnished to a sickly green, and the guest registry lay open to a page dated March 15, 2009, the hotel's final day of operation. I clicked my first photograph, the camera's flash piercing the gloom in a harsh burst of white light. For a brief moment, the shadows recoiled, revealing more than just dust and decay. The atmosphere thickened, the air itself seeming to pulse with unseen energy. The feeling of being watched intensified. I could hear faint whispers, indistinct voices weaving through the silence, drawing me deeper into the hotel's haunted history. The whispers grew louder as I moved through the hotel's winding corridors, their source elusive yet unmistakable. They seemed to seep from the very walls, fragments of conversations long past, echoes of laughter and sorrow trapped in the peeling wallpaper and cracked plaster. Each room I entered told a story of lives interrupted. A child's faded drawing taped to a broken mirror. A cracked teacup perched precariously on a dusty windowsill. The faint scent of lavender lingering in the air, as if the presence of a long-gone occupant still clung stubbornly to the space. At the end of a dim hallway, I found the ballroom, the heart of the Grand View, once alive with music and dancing. Now, its chandeliers hung like skeletal remains, and the polished floor was dull and scarred. As I raised my camera, a cold draft swept through the room, carrying with it a faint melody, a haunting piano tune that seemed to echo from somewhere deep within the walls. My breath caught as a figure flickered at the edge of my vision, a woman in a flowing gown, her face blurred but eyes shimmering with sorrow. The temperature dropped sharply, and the whispers intensified, swirling into a crescendo of voices pleading for remembrance. I knew then that the Grand View's silence was filled not with emptiness, but with stories waiting to be told, and secrets desperate to be uncovered. The air hung heavy with a silence that felt almost suffocating as I stepped closer to the open door of room 213. The man's quiet sobs echoed through the stillness, stirring a profound sadness that seemed to seep from the very walls. His presence was so vivid, so real, that for a moment I hesitated, caught between fascination and fear. The scattered papers on the nightstand trembled as if stirred by an unseen breath. I raised my camera, steadying my trembling hands, and snapped a photograph. The flash briefly illuminated the room, casting harsh shadows that danced like restless spirits across the peeling wallpaper. The man lifted his head slowly, his face etched with pain and regret, yet it dissolved into the shadows before I could capture it clearly through the lens. The faint scent of old tobacco mixed with the sharp tang of paper filled the air, wrapping the room in a time-worn embrace. I swallowed hard and stepped back, the door swinging shut behind me with a whisper that felt like a final sigh. The hallway stretched on, endless and lined with secrets, each door a portal to stories frozen in time. As I moved forward, the weight of those lost moments pressed on my chest, urging me to remember and bear witness to the lives that had passed through this place, lives filled with hope, despair, and everything in between. I stepped cautiously down the hall, each footfall muffled by the worn carpet, the faintest hint of despair hanging thick in the air. Room after room whispered fragments of lives once lived, now trapped in a spectral loop. In room 216, a young couple danced silently in the dim light, their faces radiant with love and promise. Their laughter echoed softly, mingling with the creak of the floorboards as if the walls themselves breathed with memory. I watched, entranced yet aching, as their joy seemed to flicker and fade with every heartbeat of the abandoned hotel. Further along, room 219 held a different tale. A solitary figure sat at a small desk, feverishly writing letters that seemed never to reach their destination. The paper bore stains of tears and ink blots, the words a desperate confession of regret and lost chances. I felt the weight of his sorrow settle over me, a heavy shroud of unspoken apologies. As I documented these silent echoes, the air grew colder, the shadows deeper. I could sense eyes watching from darkened corners, their gaze heavy with stories they longed to share but could not speak aloud. The hotel itself seemed alive, a vessel of trapped souls bound to its decaying frame, each room a chapter in a haunting chronicle of love, loss, and unresolved fate. I wasn't here simply as a photographer, a detached observer recording forgotten decay. No, I was a part of this place. Its memories, its ghosts, were not separate from me, they were threads woven into the fabric of my own existence. The hotel wasn't just haunted by strangers. It held pieces of my life, fragments of my soul trapped behind every door and frozen in every moment replayed in those rooms. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This place was a mirror reflecting the deepest parts of my being, the regrets, the lost loves, the pain I had carried silently for years. My trembling fingers gripped the camera tighter, grounding me as the shadows around me thickened. The hallway stretched endlessly, a labyrinth of my own memories and secrets, each room a confession I hadn't dared confront. A voice echoed faintly, a whisper carried on the stale air, "You belong here." The weight of the hotel's silent plea pressed against me, urging surrender, but somewhere deep inside, a spark of resistance flickered. I was not just a witness. I was the story. And the story was far from over. The weight of that whispered declaration settled over me like a shroud, cold and unyielding. I took a shaky breath, trying to steady the chaos raging inside. The Grand View Hotel was no longer just a building of crumbling walls and fading grandeur, it was a living repository of my past, a prison forged from my memories, fears, and unresolved regrets. As I stood in that endless hallway, the doorways lining either side like silent sentinels, the air thickened with a presence I could no longer ignore. It was as if the hotel itself was watching, waiting for me to choose, to succumb or to fight. My pulse hammered against my ribs as the whispers grew louder, voices intertwining with the creaking of the ancient floorboards and the distant sound of a piano playing a melancholy tune somewhere deep within the hotel's heart. I realized then that the hotel demanded more than documentation, it demanded reckoning. Each room was a chapter one had avoided, each spectral scene a confrontation with the parts of myself I'd buried. The hotel's ghosts were fragments of my soul, trapped between past and present, and only by facing them could I hope to break free. With trembling resolve, I raised my camera and stepped toward the nearest door. The final act was beginning. The painting arrived on a Tuesday morning, the autumn rain drumming against my windows like skeletal fingers tapping impatiently. It was propped against my front door, leaning silently as if waiting for me. There was no delivery notice, no return address, just my name scrawled across the brown paper wrapping in a handwriting I didn't recognize. My hands trembled as I brought it inside, though I told myself the cold was seeping through my jacket. I should have left it wrapped. But curiosity got the better of me. As I peeled away the paper, the landscape unfolded like a secret whispered on canvas. A meadow stretched toward distant mountains, painted in oil so fresh I could almost smell the linseed. A cobblestone path wound through tall grass, disappearing into a grove of twisted oaks whose branches seemed to writhe, even in the stillness of the painting. The air in the room grew heavy. The branches on the canvas shifted subtly, casting shadows that moved against the light. It was as if the grove was alive, watching. A chill traced my spine. I stepped back, heart pounding, the painting's surface reflecting the dim light in a way that suggested something was hidden beneath the oils, something alive. And I knew, without understanding how, that this was no ordinary painting. The room seemed to breathe around me, the shadows lengthening as the rain outside intensified, tapping an erratic rhythm against the windowpanes. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the grove of twisted oaks, their branches twisting and writhing as if reaching beyond the canvas to claim the space around me. A sudden flicker caught my peripheral vision, the faintest movement at the edge of the painting, like a ripple across still water. My breath caught in my throat. I reached out tentatively, fingertips trembling as they brushed against the surface. The oils were smooth, but beneath their glossy finish, I felt something, an unsettling warmth, almost like a pulse. Suddenly, the room chilled. A low, almost imperceptible whisper curled around me, words barely audible but unmistakably real, "Follow the path." I stumbled back, heart racing, as the cobblestone trail on the painting seemed to shimmer and shift. The twisted oaks now appeared more sinister, their shadows deepening into shapes that suggested eyes watching, waiting. Compelled by a force I couldn't explain, I grabbed my coat and stepped outside, drawn toward the woods behind my house. The storm had not abated, the wind carrying the scent of earth and wet leaves. As I walked, the whisper followed, growing louder, guiding me deeper into the trees. The painting was no mere image, it was a portal. A message. A summons. The sky outside wore the sickly yellow-green hue of an approaching storm, casting an eerie pall over everything it touched. I hung the painting in my living room, directly across from my reading chair. Its gilded frame caught the lamp's light in unsettling ways, making the shadows within seem to shift and breathe as if alive. That first night, I found myself unable to look away. My eyes burned as I stared at the peaceful scene, yet something deep within me screamed that all was wrong. The cobblestone path was what troubled me most, it curved beyond the painting's borders, hinting at a journey far longer and darker than the frame allowed. I traced its winding course with my gaze until it vanished among the twisted oaks. The urge to reach out and follow it with my finger was nearly unbearable, and I gripped my book tighter to resist. Sleep came reluctantly that night, haunted by vivid dreams of walking through tall grass, my feet finding purchase on ancient stones worn smooth by countless travelers. The dream felt more real than my bedroom, more substantial than the sheets tangled around my sweat-dampened body. Morning brought change. During my morning coffee, the early light transformed the living room into something cathedral-like, and I noticed it, the path in the painting had shifted. Not dramatically, but enough to make my chest tighten. Yesterday it had curved left, leading toward the oaks. Today, it bent slightly right, revealing a section I was certain had not been visible before. More cobblestones appeared, cracked and overgrown with moss, leading deeper into what now seemed an endless forest. My hands shook as I set down my mug, spilling coffee across the table like a dark stain. Approaching the painting on unsteady legs, breath shallow and fast, I inspected the brush strokes. The paint was undisturbed, aged and cracked as though decades old. Yet I knew with an unshakable certainty, the path had changed. I called in sick to work, the thought of leaving the painting unsupervised filling me with a panic that defied reason. What if the path moved while I was gone? What if it led somewhere I could never follow? That day, I planted myself in my chair, armed with a notepad, and began sketching the path's exact configuration every hour. My drawings grew frantic, my hand cramped from gripping the pencil too tightly. The sketches revealed no change during daylight hours, but the painting's stillness felt expectant, as if waiting for nightfall. That evening, I dozed fitfully in my chair, reluctant to leave the painting's side. When I awoke, pale moonlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the painting like a portal to another world. The path had shifted again, curving deeper into the forest and revealing glimpses of angular shadows, ancient ruins or buildings swallowed by time itself. My mouth went dry. The metallic taste of fear coated my tongue as I realized the painted world was growing, spreading beyond the frame's physical boundaries in ways that made my vision blur and my head pound. I began keeping detailed journals, documenting each change with the obsessive precision of a man unraveling. The path revealed itself slowly, sometimes branching into many routes, other times narrowing to a thin deer trail winding between massive tree trunks. Their bark bore strange markings that hurt to look at directly. My appetite vanished. Food turned to ash on my tongue. My reflection in the bathroom mirror was gaunt, hollow cheeks, red-rimmed eyes, dark circles spreading like bruises beneath them. My skin took on the pale waxiness of someone who hadn't seen sunlight in weeks. When concerned colleagues called, I lied, claiming a persistent flu. But I knew the truth. Something was coming from the painting. Something that reached beyond the oil and canvas, into me. Nights became battlegrounds between my will and the painting's silent pull. Shadows in the room lengthened, twisting unnaturally as if the grove itself sought to break free from its painted prison. The whispers I first heard grew louder, faint at first, then urgent voices chanting words I couldn't fully understand but felt deep in my bones. Sleep eluded me. Each time my eyes closed, I found myself walking that winding cobblestone path, the forest looming taller and darker with every step. The air was thick with a scent both familiar and foreign, damp earth mixed with something metallic and old. One night, as the clock struck midnight, I awoke to a low hum resonating from the painting. The cobblestones began to shimmer, the forest's twisted oaks swaying despite the stillness of my room. A pale figure emerged from the shadows, a woman with eyes like hollow moons, her presence both haunting and mournful. She beckoned silently, and without thinking, I found myself stepping toward the painting, my fingers grazing the cool surface. The world around me blurred, colors bleeding and twisting, until I was no longer in my living room but standing at the path's beginning, the painted forest alive beneath my feet. The chill of the night air was real, the rustling leaves whispering secrets I dared not speak aloud. The woman watched me with a sorrowful smile as I took my first step into the unknown. The lie came easily, whispers I told myself to stave off the creeping dread. I felt diseased, infected by something consuming me from within. The painting devoured my days and haunted my nights. I moved my sleeping bag to the living room floor, positioning it so I could watch the canvas even in darkness. Sleep became a fractured mosaic of micronaps, each interrupted by compulsive checking. Every time I opened my eyes, I braced myself to see the path had advanced, revealing more of its mysterious destination. 3 weeks after the painting's arrival, I noticed the first change in my house. It began with the wallpaper in my living room. The cheerful pattern of small blue flowers on cream faded near the painting, not uniformly, but in patches corresponding to the meadow's painted edges. Where my wall met the canvas, the domestic pattern gave way to weathered plaster, stained, eroded as if battered by decades of relentless rain and wind. My breathing quickened. I pressed my palm to the affected wall. It felt different, rougher, porous. When I pulled away, my skin was dusted with something smelling of old leaves and damp earth. The changes accelerated. Each morning brought new transformations that made my heart pound and vision swim with panic. Hardwood floors showed patches of compressed soil and scattered pebbles. The ceiling stained into cloud formations tinged with the yellow-green menace of the painted sky. I stopped answering my phone. The outside world blurred, irrelevant to the vital task of documenting my home's metamorphosis. Notebook after notebook filled with erratic observations, words that sometimes seemed to shift and rearrange themselves when unobserved. My furniture morphed. The reading chair's upholstery faded and grew patches of lichen. The coffee tables would grain twisted, gnarled, as if reclaiming its forest roots. Books on my shelves warped and swelled, pages yellowed and brittle, their texts no longer the stories I remembered. The path in the painting marched on relentlessly. It now revealed an entire village, ancient stone buildings clustered around a central square, their windows vacant and dark. Streets branched into shadowed tunnels burrowing deep underground. The detail defied the canvas's physical limits, yet there it was, spreading before my bloodshot eyes. I found myself drawn closer, my nose nearly touching the surface, peering into shadowy windows and narrow alleyways. The paint smelled of ozone and decay, a storm's breath mingled with the stale rot of forgotten graves. Sometimes I heard faint sounds, distant footsteps on cobblestones, the creak of ancient doors, whispers in unknown tongues. My house was vanishing, absorbed inch by inch into the painted world. Boundaries blurred until I could no longer tell where reality ended and the painting began. Grass sprouted through cracks in the floorboards. Wildflower scents mingled with the stale, tomb-like air. One morning, I awoke barefoot, dirt caked beneath my nails despite never having left the house. My clothes reeked of long journeys through wild places. Burrs tangled in my hair whispered of unseen travels. The painted path now spilled beyond the frame, cobblestones merging seamlessly with my transformed floor. The village was no longer empty. Figures moved through its streets, distant, indistinct, but undeniably there. They paused at windows and doorways, turning toward me with faces I couldn't clearly make out, but somehow knew. The figures, ghostly and shifting, moved with a slow, deliberate grace. Their faces remained blurred, like memories half forgotten at dawn, yet I sensed their eyes upon me, filled with recognition, longing, and something darker, warning. The village breathed with a life of its own. Cobblestones pulsed beneath the painted feet, and faint flickers of lantern light danced in windows that weren't really there. The wind whispered through invisible leaves, carrying soft murmurs that tugged at the edges of my mind. I reached out tentatively, fingertips brushing the surface where the painting bled into my floor. A sudden chill raced up my arm, as if the boundary between worlds had thinned beyond repair. From the shadows of the village, a figure emerged, taller, clearer than the others. A woman draped in tattered robes, her face etched with sorrow and wisdom. She stepped forward, her gaze locking with mine. Without words, she conveyed a message. This place was a trap, a prison for souls lost to time and memory, souls like mine, drawn into the painting's expanding realm. Her eyes held both despair and hope, a silent plea for release. I knew then that my survival depended not on fleeing, but on understanding, on navigating the path not just through the painted village, but through the tangled labyrinth of my own fractured memories. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with shadows both external and within. And as the village whispered around me, I took my first step deeper into the painted world, where reality blurred and the true journey began. The altar's surface was cold beneath my fingertips, its ancient symbols pulsating faintly with a spectral light. A hush fell over the village as if the very air held its breath. The woman's gaze bore into me, urging me to uncover what lay hidden beneath the layers of memory and pain. Closing my eyes, I let the weight of the past wash over me, faces, voices, moments I had tried to forget. Each revelation a shard of truth piercing through the fog of denial. I saw my father's sorrow, my mother's whispered fears, Sarah's anger, and the echoes of my own silence. A whisper rose, growing into a chorus of voices that filled the space, their words weaving a tapestry of confession, regret, and forgiveness. The altar became a mirror, reflecting not just my face but the tangled web of emotions I carried. As the voices reached a crescendo, the village around me began to shimmer and dissolve, the painted world fracturing like glass. The woman smiled, a bittersweet expression of release and farewell. I found myself back in my living room, the painting hanging silently on the wall. The path no longer moved. The shadows within seemed still, as if finally at peace. But deep inside, I knew the journey had changed me forever. Some prisons can be unlocked only when you face the darkness within. The sensation of being watched settled into my bones, a relentless weight pressing down on my shoulders and crawling like icy fingers along my spine. One desperate morning, I reached for the front door, yearning for escape. But as I turned the handle, the familiar world vanished. The door swung open, not onto my quiet street, but into the painted meadow. Tall grass swayed beneath a breeze that carried the distant toll of church bells and whispered secrets of things just beyond sight. The ancient cobblestone path stretched endlessly before me, worn smooth by countless feet, beckoning me toward a journey I knew I would never complete. Heart hammering like a captive bird, I slammed the door shut and stumbled back, yet the meadow's green scent seeped beneath the threshold, mingling with the haunting rustle of grass and the melodic sigh of old oak leaves. The walls of my home seemed to dissolve. Or perhaps they had become transparent, revealing a boundless painted realm of meadows, forests, villages, and ruins, all connected by paths too intricate for mortal minds. I could no longer discern where my reality ended and the painting began. My reflection in the few remaining mirrors revealed a figure fading, skin growing translucent, movements leaving shimmering trails of color in the air. My thoughts fractured, scattered across places both real and painted, existing simultaneously in multiple realms. Figures gathered now at the village square's edges, faces obscured but eyes burning with quiet fire. They beckoned, gesturing toward winding paths leading deeper into their world, inviting me to cross the threshold. I understood then, the painting was no accident. It was a portal, seeking someone like me, isolated, lonely, desperate enough to ignore the warnings until the door closed forever. Those figures once stood in living rooms like mine, having received impossible landscapes and made the irrevocable choice. As I pen these final words, my notebook rests upon what was once a coffee table, now moss-covered stone. My fingers grow increasingly transparent, the pen feeling solid even as my form fades. My house has vanished, absorbed entirely into the painted realm, leaving me suspended between reality and imagination. The path calls with patient persistence. The village awaits with infinite understanding. I hear my name whispered from painted streets, old friends welcoming me home after a long, harrowing journey. I set down my pen and take my first step onto the cobblestones. Warm beneath my feet, smoothed by countless travelers who chose this path before me. Behind, the last remnants of my former life dissolve like morning mist. Ahead stretches a world of infinite paths and eternal wandering, a reality painted in oils and bound by gilded frames. The figures in the square turn toward me, their faces mirrors of my own. I am home at last. Story 8 begins. The first morning, I noticed them. My coffee went cold in trembling hands as I stared out my kitchen window. Grooves in the sand, deeper than any animal tracks I'd ever seen. Parallel lines, carved and deliberate, stretching from the water's edge to the dunes beyond my cottage. Wide enough to fit my entire boot. A path made by something vast, dragging itself silently through the pre-dawn darkness. My heart hammered fiercely as the early light revealed the scarred shoreline. These were no random markings. They bore intent. Intelligence. Purpose. The grooves in the sand stretched on, relentless and purposeful, like the slow dragging of some colossal beast awakening from slumber. Each ridge bore the weight of something ancient, an echo of a presence that had long haunted these shores. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the patterns etched into the earth, their symmetry unnerving, as if choreographed by an unseen hand. The salty breeze carried whispers, half-heard voices woven with the crash of waves and the rustling of dune grass. I grabbed my coat and stepped outside, the damp sand cold beneath my boots. The sun was still low, casting long shadows that seemed to reach toward the sea, eager to engulf the shoreline in twilight even as dawn struggled to break. I traced the grooves slowly, each step revealing more of their enigmatic design. They disappeared beneath the dunes, swallowed by the shifting sands, leaving no trace of origin or destination. A shiver crawled along my spine. The beach, once a place of solace, now felt like a threshold, a boundary between this world and something far older, darker. That night, as the moon hung low and heavy, the wind shifted, carrying with it a new sound, a low, guttural murmur rising from the depths of the sea, like voices from the abyss calling out in forgotten tongues. Sleep eluded me. My dreams twisted into fevered visions of creatures beneath the waves, elongated limbs and glowing eyes moving just beyond the reach of light. I awoke gasping, the taste of salt thick on my tongue. Something had come ashore. And it was watching. The realization sent ice water coursing through my veins as I stumbled back from the window, breath fogging the glass in short, panicked bursts. I had come to Saltmere Cove seeking solitude, fleeing the relentless noise of the city after my divorce. The isolated coastal village seemed perfect, a cluster of weathered houses perched atop cliffs overlooking the endless gray expanse of the Atlantic. My rental cottage sat at the village's edge, close enough to the roaring sea that I could hear waves whispering ceaselessly through the bedroom walls. What I hadn't expected was to question my own sanity before the first week had ended. That morning, compelled by a restless urge, I forced myself outside to examine the marks on the beach more closely. The salty wind whipped across the sand, carrying a scent I couldn't place, something organic and ancient, like low tide mingled with the metallic tang of copper pennies. My footsteps crunched over shells and seaweed as I approached the furrows. Up close, the grooves were more disturbing than I'd imagined. The sand wasn't merely displaced, it was compacted, pressed down with immense force. Embedded within the sand were tiny fragments of iridescent scales, glittering like alien jewels beneath the pale sun. Kneeling, my fingers brushed one of the shards, and a crawling itch erupted across my skin. Nausea surged through me, and I dropped the fragment, watching it vanish into the sand as if swallowed by the earth itself. I stood and followed the tracks toward the village, my heart hammering. The path led past the weathered pier where fishing boats bobbed like broken toys, their paint peeling, hulls stained with salt and time. As I walked, eyes seemed to watch me from behind curtained windows, faces gaunt and weathered, carved from the same greystone as the cliffs themselves. At the village center, the general store stood low and squat. The wooden sign creaked, hanging askew in the wind. The bell above the door let out a discordant clang as I entered. Behind the counter, the elderly shopkeeper lifted his eyes, storm cloud gray and weary. Mentioning the tracks on the beach caused his face to pale, lips murmuring something about storms churning debris ashore before he busied himself with organizing shelves. His hands trembled, a fearful tremor poorly masked by feigned disinterest. I left with more questions than answers, certain the villagers knew more than they admitted. That night, strange sounds invaded my sleep. Beneath the ceaseless crash of waves came heavy breathing, rhythmic, deep, as if something vast slumbered just beyond my walls. Dreams of dark waters and colossal, unblinking eyes haunted my restless nights. Awakening, I found new tracks outside my cottage, smaller, more numerous, radiating from the original furrows like spokes on a sinister wheel. They led straight to my front door, stopping just shy of the threshold. My mouth dried to dust. Whatever had made those tracks had been close enough to touch my windows as I slept. Paranoia took root, a relentless itch between my shoulder blades warning of unseen eyes. During the day, I double and triple-checked locks and windows, though they'd already been secured. The village itself felt changed. Quieter. The inhabitants seemed to hold their collective breath. At the store, conversation ceased abruptly when I approached, replaced by whispered exchanges in an ancient dialect, words older than English itself. Delving into the village's history, I uncovered troubling records in the cramped library above the post office. Faded documents repeatedly mentioned the old compact, alongside offerings and tithes paid to She Who Rises, an entity shrouded in legend and fear. The deeper I delved into Saltmere Cove's past, the darker the shadows became. The old compact, a pact whispered about in trembling tones, was said to bind the village to an ancient force lurking beneath the waves. She Who Rises, the villagers called her, a name spoken only in hushed prayer and fearful warning. According to the faded records, centuries ago, the settlers struck a desperate bargain with this entity to protect their homes from relentless storms and the unforgiving sea. In exchange, the village was to offer periodic sacrifices, tokens of blood and obedience, to keep her wrath at bay. But the records hinted at a price far heavier than mere offerings. There were mentions of disappearances, strange illnesses, and nightmares so vivid they tore at the fabric of reality. The village's silence wasn't just from fear, it was a pact of secrecy, a collective denial to keep the darkness contained. The night air grew colder as I pieced together the fragments of history, and a terrible realization settled over me: the marks on the beach weren't just tracks, they were warnings. Signs of her stirring. The villagers averted gazes, their whispered warnings in an ancient tongue, they all made sense now. She was awake. And she was hungry. The night I finally confronted She Who Rises began with a storm unlike any I had ever witnessed. Thunder growled through the darkened sky, lightning lancing jagged scars across the angry clouds. The wind tore through Saltmere Cove like a ravenous beast, bending trees and sending waves crashing violently against the jagged cliffs. Drawn by a force I could neither resist nor comprehend, I made my way to the beach. The grooves in the sand were now glowing faintly, pulsing with an eerie bioluminescence that cast ghostly light over the churning sea. The air was thick with the metallic scent I had come to associate with her presence, a blend of salt, rust, and something far older and fouler. The water before me roiled and twisted as if alive, shadows shifting beneath the surface like the restless limbs of some colossal, slumbering creature. Then, slowly, impossibly, the sea began to part. From the depths emerged a towering figure, its form both fluid and monstrous, an amalgam of seaweed, coral, and shadow. Its eyes burned like molten gold, blazing with ancient intelligence and hunger. Tendrils of water wrapped around its massive frame, each movement stirring the ocean into violent froth. The villagers had called her She Who Rises, and now I understood why. She was the storm incarnate, the wrath of the ocean given form, a primordial force older than time, bound by neither mercy nor reason. I stood rooted to the spot, the roar of the tempest deafening, yet her voice reached me, not in words, but in a flood of emotions, fury, sorrow, and a chilling demand for what was owed. I was no longer a mere visitor in this village or this world. I was the latest bearer of the compact, the next sacrifice in an unbroken chain stretching back centuries. The path forward was clear and terrible. To survive, I would have to face her, confront the ancient pact, and find a way to break the cycle before Saltmere Cove was swallowed forever. The storm's fury whipped around me, rain lashing my skin like shards of ice as the towering form of She Who Rises loomed over the turbulent sea. Her molten gold eyes pierced through the tempest, locking onto me with a gaze that stripped away every pretense, every false hope. The primal force that had haunted Saltmere Cove for centuries was alive, and it demanded reckoning. A voice, deep, resonant, and impossibly ancient, echoed in my mind. It was no spoken word but a tide of emotions flooding my consciousness, anger born from betrayal, sorrow wrought from endless waiting, and hunger, a consuming, aching need that no mortal offering could satisfy. The villagers' pact, the sacrifices, the silence, they had all been desperate attempts to appease this relentless force. And now, as the latest bearer, the mantle passed to me. I felt the weight of centuries pressed down like the crushing depths of the ocean itself. Yet within that crushing despair, a flicker of resolve ignited. I was not willing to surrender to a fate written long before my time. Gathering every ounce of courage, I stepped forward into the churning surf. The cold water surged around me, a living barrier between the known world and the abyss. She who rises extended a tendril of water, and I felt the pull, the irresistible lure of oblivion. But instead of retreating, I raised my voice, not in fear but in defiance. I refuse your claim, I declared, voice cutting through the roaring wind. The storm paused, a pregnant silence hanging between us. Then, slowly, a challenge. To break the ancient compact, to free Saltmere Cove, I must navigate the labyrinth of forgotten promises, uncover the truth buried beneath layers of history and myth. The path would be perilous, demanding sacrifices not measured in blood alone, but in truth, courage, and the willingness to confront my deepest fears. As lightning split the sky, I vowed to face whatever darkness awaited, to wrest freedom from the grip of this ancient sea goddess. The battle for Saltmere Cove had begun. Night fell with an unnatural swiftness, as if the sun had been pulled below the horizon by unseen hands rather than sinking with its usual grace. Shadows deepened rapidly, swallowing the village in a suffocating darkness that pressed against my skin like a wet shroud. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of salt and decay, and the whisper of the ocean seemed to pulse in time with my own racing heartbeat. I stood in the center of the circle the tracks had formed around my cottage, feeling the damp sand shift beneath my feet. The texture was no longer soft and yielding but cold and dense, like the ocean floor rising to claim its prey. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, yet my limbs felt weighted, reluctant to move as if bound by invisible chains. The silence was broken by a low, guttural rumble rolling from the depths of the sea, resonating through the ground beneath me. Then, from the black water, a slow, deliberate shape emerged, vast and sinuous, its scales shimmering with a ghostly light beneath the crashing waves. Eyes, ancient and unblinking, fixed upon me, filled with a hunger beyond comprehension. The village around me was eerily still. Lights flickered out one by one in windows like dying stars, and the murmured voices I'd heard before ceased entirely, swallowed by the oppressive night. I realized then, with crushing clarity, that I was not merely a visitor caught in a strange place, I was the chosen. The one who had awakened the ancient covenant and whose fate was now intertwined with the dark depths below. The ocean's cold breath washed over me as the creature's presence grew nearer, and the last barrier between the world I knew and the abyss beyond dissolved like morning mist. The creature's approach was slow, deliberate, each undulating movement sending ripples across the turbulent sea that reached toward me like grasping hands. The salty spray stung my face, mingling with the cold sweat that drenched my skin. My heart thundered in my chest, threatening to burst free from its cage, yet I stood rooted, eyes locked on the glowing orbs beneath the water's surface. As it drew nearer, the water parted to reveal a form that defied logic, an immense, serpentine figure woven from seaweed, barnacles, and ancient coral, its scales shimmering with a spectral light that flickered like dying stars. Its eyes burned with an intelligence that transcended time, an awareness that weighed heavy with sorrow and rage. The voice came, not through sound, but through a flood of emotion crashing into my mind. Anguish, betrayal, and an insatiable hunger for restitution. The compact forged centuries ago had been broken, and the creature's patience, like the sea in storm, had reached its limit. It offered a choice, submission or sacrifice, freedom or oblivion. I felt the crushing weight of generations bearing down on me, the fate of Saltmere Cove hanging in the balance. Summoning every shred of courage, I refused to bow to fear. "This ends now," I whispered. The tempest roared in response, waves smashing against the shore, and the creature retreated, vanishing beneath the churning depths, but its warning lingered, etched into my very soul. The battle for Saltmere Cove was far from over. The storm's fury simmered beneath the surface, a restless energy that pulsed through the very bones of Saltmere Cove. Though the creature had withdrawn, its presence lingered, a shadow cast long over the village and my soul. Days blurred into nights as I delved deeper into the ancient texts and whispered legends, searching for a way to sever the cursed compact that bound the villagers to the sea's wrath. Each page I turned revealed fragments of rituals long forgotten, sacrifices not just of flesh but of memory and will. The villagers, once distant and fearful, began to approach me under the veil of night, their faces etched with desperation and hope. They shared stories passed down through generations, tales of hidden altars beneath the cliffs, of songs sung to calm the restless waters, and of a chosen one who could rewrite the fate of Saltmere Cove. Armed with their trust and the knowledge I had unearthed, I prepared for a final confrontation. The air was thick with salt and the promise of change as we gathered beneath the ancient oak at the cliff's edge, the waves crashing like thunder below. The ritual was a delicate dance of light and shadow, voices rising in unison to pierce the veil between worlds. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the sea responded, a towering wave, luminous and fierce, rose to meet us. In that moment, I understood that the true battle was not with the creature alone, but with the fears and secrets that had bound us all for centuries. With a steady heart, I stepped forward into the crashing tide, ready to face whatever darkness awaited, determined to break the chains and bring dawn to Saltmere Cove. The village seemed to breathe again under the soft light of dawn, yet beneath its calm surface, the tension lingered like a silent storm waiting to break. The blue-green glow, the deliberate knocking, and that ancient voice, all remnants of a night where worlds brushed and boundaries thinned. As I stepped cautiously to the window, the emptiness of the beach mocked the terror of the hours before. No tracks, no signs of passage, just the gentle rhythm of waves kissing the shore. The villagers moved with ordinary purpose, their faces blank masks of daily routine. But I knew better. The calm was a fragile veneer, a pause between heartbeats in a dance that had long been choreographed by forces older than time. The compact was far from broken. And she who rises still awaited. The question was no longer if she would return, but when, and whether I would be ready. The silence pressed down like a suffocating shroud, an absence so profound it seemed to drain the very air from my lungs. The train car, once a haven of motion and distant dreams, had become a tomb of stillness and shadows. I stepped cautiously toward the open door, the eerie yellow pools cast by the flickering lamps barely lighting the way. Inside the waiting room, the rows of wooden benches stretched endlessly into a darkness that swallowed all sense of space and time. The ticket window, encased behind spiderwebbed glass and rusted iron bars, seemed to guard secrets long forgotten. A cold draft whispered through broken panes, carrying faint echoes of footsteps and distant voices that sent a shiver racing down my spine. The fog outside writhed like a living thing, curling and twisting with a purpose I could not fathom. My heart hammered violently as I took a tentative step into the station, the wooden floorboards groaning underfoot as if warning me away. Every shadow seemed to flicker with hidden movement, figures just beyond clear sight, vanishing whenever I tried to focus. A chill gripped me as the fog thickened, swallowing the platform and creeping inward like tendrils of some ancient menace. The distant clang of a bell echoed, hollow and mournful, before silence reclaimed the night once more. I knew then that this station was no ordinary place. It existed outside time, a liminal realm where the living and the dead brushed shoulders. Somewhere within its endless corridors and shadowed corners lay the key to my escape, or my doom. With a trembling breath, I ventured deeper into the darkness, each step drawing me further from the world I knew and closer to the heart of the mystery that had trapped me. The darkness inside the station seemed to pulse with a life of its own, thick and suffocating. Each step I took echoed through the cavernous waiting room, swallowed by the vast emptiness beyond. The faint flicker of a distant light beckoned me deeper into the shadows, casting long, dancing silhouettes that stretched and twisted with sinister intent. As I moved forward, the air grew colder, the metallic tang in my mouth thickening with every breath. The wooden benches, once sturdy and reliable, now groaned under invisible weight, as if burdened by the weight of countless lost souls. The cracked glass of the ticket window reflected fragments of a face, my face, but distorted, warped by something unseen. A soft whisper floated through the air, unintelligible yet laden with urgent despair. It seemed to seep from the very walls, wrapping around me like cold mist. Panic fluttered in my chest, but curiosity propelled me onward. Beyond the waiting room, a narrow corridor stretched out, lined with doors numbered in peeling gold leaf. Each doorway seemed to breathe, the wood grain shifting and writhing as if alive. The whispers grew louder, forming broken phrases in archaic tongues that I somehow understood: return, remember, the passage, the price. I reached for a door at random, number 13, its surface slick and cold beneath my trembling hand. The door creaked open to reveal a dimly lit chamber, its walls lined with dusty luggage and forgotten possessions. A solitary chair sat in the center, occupied by a shadowy figure whose back was turned to me. As I stepped inside, the figure slowly turned. Hollow eyes met mine, and an agonized scream tore through the silence, a sound that was both human and otherworldly. The figure vanished like smoke, leaving behind a chilling emptiness. A sudden gust extinguished the faint light, plunging me into darkness. The whispers became screams, voices overlapping in a cacophony of sorrow and warning. I fumbled for my flashlight, heart hammering as the beam pierced the blackness, revealing an endless sea of empty seats, stretching beyond all reason. Trapped between realities, I realized the station was no mere place of transit, it was a limbo for lost souls, a prison of forgotten memories. And I was its newest prisoner. The endless cycle tightened its grip around me like the cold fog that refused to lift. Each loop through the station was a cruel reminder that escape was an illusion. No matter how fast I ran, how far I wandered, I was trapped in a labyrinth of time and shadow. The shifting words on the window were no longer simple messages, they became a chant, a haunting refrain. You can't leave. We've been waiting. The journey is endless. Every time I dared to look away, the figures in the fog shifted just out of sight, ghostly passengers condemned to the same eternal limbo. Their hollow eyes seemed to plead, warning me of the fate that awaited should I fail to break the cycle. The rattling of the train wheels echoed like a death knell as the car lurched forward and backward, the outside world dissolving into a monochrome blur. The station itself seemed to breathe, walls contracting and expanding, folding space around me in a maddening dance. My breath came in ragged gasps. The metallic taste in my mouth thickened, and cold sweat slicked my skin. I clawed at the seat, desperate to ground myself in any reality. In a moment of fleeting clarity, I noticed a small compartment beneath my seat, a dusty, forgotten drawer. Inside lay an old pocket watch, its surface etched with strange symbols glowing faintly in the dim light. The watch's hands began to move, counter to time itself, ticking backward with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Hope surged through me like electricity. Perhaps this relic held the key to unraveling the endless loop. But as the watch's ticking filled the car, the figures in the fog gathered at the windows, their faces contorted in silent screams, reaching out through the glass as the fog thickened to a suffocating wall. The station was awakening. And I was running out of time. The forest breathes differently at night. Every branch cracks with malevolent intention, every shadow harbors something that shouldn't exist, and each step forward feels like a mistake carved into the fabric of your soul, one you can never undo. I learned this truth one October evening, beneath a moon swollen and jaundiced like a cataract glaring down through the thick pine canopy. That night, with each footfall on the damp forest floor, my world began to unravel, thread by fragile thread. For months, I had walked these trails, seeking refuge from the relentless weight of life. The endless grind of office hours, the sharp sting of my supervisor's condescending remarks, the tinnitus ringing in my skull, all had driven me here. This path, winding through Douglas firs and maples, beside the creek that babbled its mindless litany, past the fallen log where I sometimes sat smoking cigarettes I'd quit 3 times, had become my only sanctuary. But that night, the forest shifted beneath my skin. The familiar transformed into the uncanny. Shadows stretched too long, contorted into impossible shapes just beyond the corner of my eye. The wind whispered secrets I wasn't meant to hear, ancient murmurs that crawled into my mind like cold fingers. Suddenly, the creek's cheerful babble twisted into a low, guttural growl. The fallen log, once a quiet resting place, seemed to pulse with dark energy. I stopped, heart pounding, senses sharpening to a fearful clarity. Something watched. Not from a distance, but close, too close. My breath hitched as a figure emerged between the trees, a silhouette darker than night, without form or substance, yet undeniably present. It moved with the slow inevitability of a nightmare made flesh, eyes glowing faintly like embers in the gloom. The forest was alive, and it was hungry. The figure glided closer, its presence bending the air with a chilling cold that seeped into my bones. The ground beneath my feet felt unnaturally soft, as if the earth itself recoiled from the darkness approaching. I tried to speak, but my voice caught in my throat, swallowed by the oppressive silence that now blanketed the forest. Its eyes, glowing embers that burned with a terrible knowledge, locked onto mine. In them, I saw not malice, but a sorrow so deep it twisted like a knot in my chest. It was a guardian of forgotten things, a sentinel of the old world, bound to the forest's secrets and shadows. The moonlight flickered as the branches above whispered warnings, urging me to flee, yet my feet remained rooted, caught in a web of fear and fascination. The figure raised a hand, long, slender, and impossibly pale, and beckoned me forward, as if inviting me to uncover the hidden truths buried beneath the forest floor. With trembling steps, I followed, every sound magnified, the crunch of leaves, the snap of twigs, until we reached a clearing bathed in silver light. At its center stood a stone altar, ancient and worn, etched with symbols that pulsed faintly with otherworldly energy. The figure gestured toward the altar, and I understood that this was no chance encounter. The forest had drawn me here to face something I had long tried to forget. As the wind carried the scent of pine and decay, I braced myself to uncover the forest's deepest secret, a truth that would change everything I thought I knew about myself and the world around me. The days that followed offered little solace. Each morning, sunlight filtered through my curtains but failed to penetrate the growing darkness that clung to my mind. I avoided mirrors, fearing another encounter with that malevolent doppelganger lurking just beneath the glass. Yet, even in the absence of direct reflection, I felt its gaze, cold, calculating, and unyielding, pressing upon my very soul. Nightfall became a battleground. Shadows twisted into shapes that whispered secrets I dared not hear, and every creak of the house was a reminder that I was no longer alone. The mirror's sinister invitation lingered in my thoughts, an unrelenting echo that pulled me toward the forest, toward the unknown. One evening, driven by a mix of terror and a desperate need for answers, I returned to the ancient tree. The forest seemed to recognize me, branches recoiled, and the air thickened with anticipation. The mirror awaited, its dark surface shimmering faintly in the moonlight as if alive. With trembling hands, I reached toward it once more, bracing myself for the horrors that might emerge from its depths. The predatory smile reappeared, wider and more confident, beckoning me into a world where reflection and reality blurred, and where the shadows held dominion over the light. I knew then that my journey was far from over. The forest had claimed me in ways I couldn't yet understand, and the mirror was but a gateway to a deeper, darker truth that awaited my courage, or my surrender. The mirror's surface rippled like dark water as I stared into its depths, the predatory smile slowly dissolving into a swirling void that seemed to pull at the edges of my sanity. My fingers grazed the cool glass, and a sudden chill shot through my body, as if the barrier between this world and the shadowed realm behind the mirror had thinned to a fragile veil. Suddenly, the forest around me fell deathly silent. The wind ceased, the night creatures stilled, and even my own breath seemed to freeze in my lungs. In that oppressive silence, the mirror's depths began to shift, revealing flickering images, fragments of memories not my own, faces distorted by fear, fleeting shadows running through dark woods, whispered pleas for release. A voice echoed, low and rasping, threading itself through the stillness like a spectral wind. It spoke my name, calling me deeper into the reflection, into a world where light died and darkness ruled unchallenged. Panic surged as I stumbled back, heart pounding like a war drum. But my reflection reached out once more, this time not as a cruel mimic, but as a desperate guide. Its eyes held a flicker of something almost human, sorrow, longing, and a plea for salvation. The mirror wasn't just a gateway. It was a prison. A prison where something, or someone, was trapped, and now, so was I. As the forest closed in around me, the mirror's edges began to dissolve, pulling me inexorably forward. The last thing I saw before the world went black was the smile, no longer predatory, but haunted, of my own reflection, beckoning me into the unknown. The scar was fresh and vivid, a thin line cutting across the reflection's skin like a whispered secret I had never known, yet it was undeniably mine. My pulse quickened, a mixture of fear and fascination rooting me in place. How could this other self, this shadowy twin, bear marks I had never sustained? Was it a glimpse of a past I had forgotten, or a fragment of a future I was yet to live? I held the handheld mirror close, watching the mundane reflection stare back at me with familiar eyes. Then, shifting my gaze to the forest mirror, I saw that the other version now reached out, pressing its palm firmly against the glass as if trying to cross the boundary between our worlds. Its eyes, sharp and insistent, locked onto mine, urging me to step closer, to accept whatever fate lingered behind that shimmering surface. The forest around me seemed to pulse with tension, the night alive with an eerie stillness that made my skin crawl. The breeze stilled, the rustle of leaves faded, and even the distant hoot of an owl was silenced. Time stretched thin, balanced on a knife's edge between reality and the unknown. A whisper floated through the darkness, barely audible yet unmistakably clear, "Your time." I swallowed hard, the weight of the moment pressing down like a stone. The path before me was no longer a choice, it was a summons. To step beyond the mirror's veil was to embrace a destiny that defied understanding, to confront the part of myself hidden in shadow. With trembling hands, I took a hesitant step forward, the forest mirror's surface rippling like dark water, ready to pull me into a world where reflection and reality intertwined in a dance as old as time itself. Beyond the mirror's rippling surface, a chill wind whispered secrets that seemed to unravel the very fabric of my being. As I stepped forward, the glass gave way beneath my touch, not breaking, but dissolving like mist, inviting me into a realm suspended between light and shadow. The world I entered was a twilight expanse, where trees arched like skeletal fingers against a bruised sky, and the air hung thick with the scent of forgotten memories and distant sorrows. The ground beneath my feet was soft and yielding, covered in a carpet of decayed leaves that muffled every sound, save for the quiet echo of my own heartbeat. Shapes moved at the edge of my vision, figures cloaked in shadow, their faces obscured but their eyes glinting with ancient wisdom and pain. They did not approach, but neither did they retreat. Instead, they seemed to watch, waiting patiently for what was to come. A voice, neither male nor female, spoke from the depths of the gloom, "You have crossed the threshold. Now, you must face the weight of what you carry." I felt a sudden surge of memories, not just my own, but echoes of lives intertwined with mine, past choices and unspoken regrets manifesting as whispers in the wind. The shadowed figures began to step forward, revealing themselves as fragments of my own fears and hopes, each one a piece of the puzzle that was my fractured self. To move forward, I would have to confront them all. With a breath heavy with resolve, I stepped deeper into the twilight realm, prepared to face the shadows within and uncover the truth that had long eluded me. The air grew heavier with each step, pressing against my chest like the weight of 1,000 unspoken fears. The shadowed figures gathered closer, their forms flickering between solidity and mist, faces shifting, sometimes familiar, sometimes utterly alien. They whispered my name in a chorus of voices, some gentle, others accusing, all entwined in a haunting symphony of my own doubts and regrets. Ahead, a faint glow pulsed, an altar carved from black stone, etched with symbols that seemed to writhe beneath the surface, alive with a dark energy. It called to me, promising answers but demanding sacrifice. As I approached, one figure stepped forward, a version of myself, younger, eyes wide with innocence and pain. Without words, it handed me a mirror shard, its surface reflecting not my face, but a fractured mosaic of memories, moments I had tried to forget, choices I had denied, and truths I had buried deep within. The shard trembled in my hand, and a voice echoed from the depths, "To reclaim yourself, you must accept the whole, the light and the shadow. Only then will the path home reveal itself." A sudden chill swept through the realm as the altar's glow intensified, illuminating the figures now circling me. Each awaited my answer, a silent challenge to face the darkness within and embrace the tangled truth of my existence. With trembling resolve, I raised the shard and stared into the fractured memories, ready to confront the parts of myself I had long denied, and to find the way back from the shadows. The line between myself and the reflection blurred, inch by inch, until the mirror's version of me no longer belonged solely to its dark world, it seeped into mine. I found moments when my thoughts felt foreign, my emotions twisted in ways I couldn't explain. Small actions I didn't remember doing, memories that felt borrowed, like fragments of someone else's life invading my own. The mirror version was rewriting me from within, reshaping my reality to match the life it had shown behind the glass, the life I yearned for but had never lived. With each passing day, the grip of that seductive reflection tightened, pulling me further from my true self. I struggled desperately to hold on to who I was, but the forest mirror was patient, unrelenting. Its dark depths whispered promises of escape, of transformation, of a second chance at life, but at a cost I could barely comprehend. One night, as I stared into the glass, the other me smiled, no longer with menace or desperation, but with cold certainty. Its eyes held the final warning: a choice had to be made. Complete the exchange and disappear into the shadow realm, or resist and risk losing everything, including myself. My breath caught in my throat. The mirror's surface rippled again, inviting, daring, and the pull between two realities became impossible to ignore. The room seemed to hold its breath as I stood before the mirror, the tension between the two worlds humming like a live wire in the air. My reflection's eyes bore into mine, a silent demand that was impossible to resist. The promise of a new life, of success and happiness, dangled just beyond the glass, yet the price whispered in the shadows was no less than my very soul. My hand trembled as I reached out again, the electric tingling crawling up my arm like restless spiders. The moment our palms touched through the thin veil of glass, the world shuddered. Reality rippled and twisted, colors bleeding into one another, and a low, guttural hum filled my ears, a sound that seemed to come from the depths of existence itself. Suddenly, I was no longer in my room. I stood in a shadowed realm, a place where light dared not linger and time folded upon itself. The air was thick with the scent of ancient wood smoke and forgotten regrets. My reflection was beside me now, no longer confined to glass but walking, breathing, a living specter sharing my form. It smiled, but the smile was hollow, a mask for a hunger that chilled my bones. "Welcome," it said, voice like the scraping of stone. "You belong here now." Panic surged through me, but escape was impossible. The mirror behind us vanished, replaced by endless darkness. I realized then that the exchange was complete. I had crossed into a prison of shadows, while the other wore my face in the world above. As days turned to nights in this liminal space, I felt myself fading, my memories slipping like grains of sand through trembling fingers. Yet somewhere, deep within, a spark of resistance kindled. The fight for self was far from over. The book's cover was embossed with symbols I didn't recognize, an interlocking maze of lines and circles that seemed to shift subtly under the lamp's flickering light. The leather smelled of old earth and forgotten secrets, its scent both intoxicating and unsettling. I reached out with trembling fingers, feeling a faint pulse as my skin brushed the worn surface. The moment I touched it, a whisper curled around the edges of my consciousness, soft, unintelligible, but heavy with meaning. Opening the book, I found its pages filled with handwritten entries, ink faded but legible. The text was a diary of sorts, chronicling strange occurrences within the library over decades. Stories of books rearranging themselves, phantom footsteps echoing through the stacks, and shadows slipping between shelves. The author spoke of an ancient presence bound to the building, something that thrived in silence and darkness, feeding on forgotten knowledge and the fear of the lonely. As I read deeper, the diary detailed how the presence had once been a guardian of knowledge, but had grown corrupted by centuries of neglect and isolation. It no longer protected, but imprisoned. Patrons who stayed too late reported visions, books whispering their darkest secrets, pages turning on their own, voices echoing from empty aisles. Some vanished without a trace, swallowed by the labyrinthine corridors of the library. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the entries stopped abruptly. On the night the previous night librarian disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only this cursed diary. My heart hammered with a mix of dread and curiosity. The book wasn't just a record, it was a warning and a trap, an invitation to join the silent watchers bound to the library's endless shelves. That night, the library grew colder, shadows lengthened into impossible shapes, and I felt eyes watching from the darkness. The whispers returned, more insistent, calling me to lose myself in the infinite stories that might never end. The clock on the wall ticked slowly, each second dragging like a heavy footstep in the silent library. As midnight approached, the air thickened, becoming almost viscous with unseen tension. I heard the faint shuffle of pages turning somewhere deep within the stacks, though the aisles appeared empty in the dim light. My breath fogged the cold air, and a creeping sensation crawled over my skin, as if the library itself were watching, waiting. Compelled by a mixture of fear and fascination, I ventured deeper into the labyrinth of shelves. My flashlight beam caught glimpses of faded titles, their spines cracked and faded by time, but also something else, shadows that didn't belong to me or the flickering light. Shapes flickered just beyond vision, retreating whenever I turned my head. Suddenly, a book thumped to the floor a few feet ahead. I froze, heart pounding, listening to the slow, echoing sound as it hit the dusty floor. Gathering courage, I stepped forward and picked up the volume. It was an old tome bound in cracked leather, the title faded beyond recognition. As I opened it, I felt a chill that plunged deep into my bones. The words inside seemed to rearrange themselves, forming sentences I hadn't seen moments before, warnings and pleas from those trapped within these walls. Whispers rose around me, soft and unintelligible at first, then growing clearer. They spoke in voices both young and old, male and female, speaking of despair, regret, and a desperate hope for escape. I tried to shut the book, but my hands betrayed me, holding it open against my will. The library groaned, shelves shifting subtly, as if responding to the voices. I turned to leave, but the exit seemed to recede, the corridors stretching infinitely in all directions. Panic surged as I realized I was no longer alone. Figures emerged from the darkness, pale faces framed by shadows, eyes reflecting a sorrow older than the building itself. They drifted silently, their mouths moving in silent pleas for release. Trapped between reality and nightmare, I knew the library was not just a building but a prison of stories and souls, and I had stepped inside its darkest chapter. The book ended with a chilling line: by Friday evening, Marcus Reed will realize the true cost of knowledge, a price that cannot be paid in money or time. I slammed the volume shut, my heart racing like a drumbeat echoing through the empty library. My fingers trembled uncontrollably, and for the first time, I questioned everything I thought I knew about reality. Was this some cruel joke? A hallucination born of exhaustion? Or something darker, something that had woven itself into the very fabric of my existence? The following nights brought more books, each arriving precisely at 2:17 a.m. Each chronicling my life with unnerving accuracy and increasing detail. The library no longer felt like a place of refuge or knowledge, it was a trap, a living entity feeding on my future, dragging me into a predestined story I desperately wanted to rewrite but couldn't escape. Mrs. Petton's warnings echoed in my mind, the rules I'd foolishly ignored. Never go beyond the main reading room after 1 a.m. Never reshelf the mysterious books. Always keep the desk lamp burning. But curiosity had already taken root, and every shadow seemed to whisper my name. I knew that crossing that boundary would unleash secrets and shadows beyond comprehension, and possibly seal my fate within these endless stacks of time. The clock ticked on. And somewhere in the quiet corners of the library, unseen eyes watched patiently, waiting for the next page to turn. That night, the library's atmosphere shifted. The lamplight flickered as if caught in a gust of invisible wind. My breath hung in the air like a mist, and the silence felt heavier, more oppressive, than ever before. I found myself drawn toward the restricted section, the corridor that led beyond the main reading room where the ancient tomes were kept behind iron gates. My pulse thundered with every step. The warnings echoed, don't go beyond 1 a.m., don't reshelf the unexplainable books. Yet my feet moved with a will not my own, guided by a force older than time. At the iron gate, the locks clicked open silently, as if inviting me inside. The musty scent of aged paper and forgotten knowledge enveloped me, the air thick with centuries of secrets. Shelves towered over me, filled with volumes whose spines bore strange symbols and titles written in languages I couldn't read. There, resting on a pedestal bathed in ghostly moonlight filtering through stained glass, was the final book, its leather cracked and worn, but pulsing softly with an inner light. Its title was simple yet horrifying, The Chronicle of Lost Souls. With trembling hands, I opened it. The pages were blank at first, but words began to bleed across the paper, ink swirling like smoke into a story that felt impossibly familiar, my own life, but darker. A tale not only of events to come but of choices made in shadows and the price paid by those who sought forbidden truths. A whisper echoed through the room, a chorus of voices mingling with the rustling of pages. They spoke of the library itself, how it was no mere building, but a vessel, a prison, a living archive that collected souls tethered to their stories, trapping them in cycles of repetition and despair. I realized then that the library had claimed others before me, lost wanderers who, like myself, had been lured by curiosity and entangled in the web of endless narratives. And now, it sought to bind me forever within its walls. The lamplight flickered one last time before plunging the room into darkness. The book snapped shut, and an icy hand seemed to grasp my heart, squeezing tight. I was no longer merely a visitor. I was a chapter, a verse, a ghost written into the endless chronicle of Hartwell Memorial Library. Outside the iron gates, the whispering continued, soft, relentless, promising escape only through surrender. My choices were clear: embrace the story, or fight to rewrite the ending. But in a place where every page was already written, what hope was there for freedom? The figure's presence was fleeting, always just beyond the edge of clarity, vanishing whenever I blinked or turned toward it. Yet each glimpse left me with a lingering chill, a silent warning that I was not alone in the library's shadows. The mirrors became portals to a hidden world, one that existed layered atop the dusty shelves and dim corridors, inhabited by something ancient and relentless. One night, I found a new volume waiting on my desk, its cover darker than the others, almost as if it absorbed the light around it. The title was scrawled in the same haunting script, The Final Chapter of Marcus Reed. Hands trembling, I opened it, and the pages revealed not just predictions or accounts, but demands, instructions for what I must do to complete the story and secure my place in the library's eternal narrative. The book spoke of a ritual, a surrender of free will in exchange for freedom from the endless cycle. It warned that refusal meant being trapped forever as a ghostly chronicler, forever recording others' lives without living my own. I realized then that the library was no mere archive but a living, breathing entity feeding on the stories of those it ensnared, and I was fast becoming one of its most precious captives. My fingers hovered over the final page, the weight of choice pressing down like the centuries of dust that coated the shelves. To obey was to lose myself, to resist meant an uncertain battle against a force beyond comprehension. The shadows lengthened, and in the dim light, the figure in the mirror finally stepped forward, a silent reminder that in this place, every story is written in shadows, and every ending is just the beginning of another. The shadows recoiled, flickering like dying flames, as the library itself seemed to hold its breath. The air crackled with the tension of a world unmade and remade by the stroke of a single pen. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, but this time it was a rhythm of defiance, of reclaiming a life long held captive by unseen forces. Pages spilled from the old volumes, swirling in a tempest of ink and parchment, and the haunting script dissolved into a formless mist. I felt the weight that had burdened so many past versions of myself begin to lift, replaced by a fragile, exhilarating freedom, the promise of choice where once there was only inevitability. As dawn's first light filtered weakly through the stained glass, the presence withdrew, its howls of frustration echoing faintly among the stacks. The library was silent once more, but I knew this was not the end of its hunger, only a pause. Yet, in that pause, I had carved out a sliver of true autonomy. The story of Marcus Reed was no longer a trap but a path unfolding before me, uncharted and uncertain. I closed the notebook, my hand still warm from the fire of creation, and stepped away from the desk. Outside, the world awaited, not a scripted stage, but a canvas of endless possibilities. And for the first time in a long time, I was free to write my own story. The workshop seemed to breathe with quiet life as the day faded into evening, the air thick with the scent of varnish and sawdust. Yet, the mannequin's gaze never wavered from me, her glass eyes reflecting a flicker of something I couldn't quite place, something alive beneath the stillness. I chalked it up to exhaustion, to the long hours and creeping isolation of the restoration trade. But the unease settled deep in my bones, a silent pulse that refused to be ignored. As twilight deepened, I found myself drawn back to her, compelled to study the subtle details that made her almost human. The delicate curve of her jaw, the slight parting of her lips, the delicate veins painted beneath her translucent skin. With each passing hour, the room grew colder, shadows lengthening and deepening like ink spilled across the wooden floor. My fingers itched to reach out, to touch her smooth cheek, but I hesitated, as if afraid that contact might break some fragile barrier between the living and the inanimate. That night, long after the workshop had fallen silent and the city outside had slipped into slumber, I awoke to the faintest whisper of movement. The mannequin's eyes caught the moonlight, glinting with a strange intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. The raised hand, once frozen in a silent plea, seemed to tremble, the fingers flexing ever so slightly as if trying to reach for something just beyond reach. I whispered a promise to protect her, to uncover the story she carried in her porcelain heart. For she was no mere object. She was a vessel of memories, a silent witness to a forgotten past, and perhaps a warning still waiting to be heard. The workshop grew colder as the nights wore on, the air thick with anticipation and an unsettling stillness. Each time I glanced away, the mannequin moved, slipping into a new pose that seemed to speak a language only the universe could understand, a silent prophecy cast in plaster and silk. One evening, I set up a small camera to record her through the night. The footage was grainy and flickered with static, but the movements were undeniable. Between 2:15 and 2:55 a.m., she shifted with uncanny grace, every motion smooth and deliberate, like a dance rehearsed in some unseen theater. The following morning, the news greeted me with a chill. A local woman had narrowly escaped a car accident at precisely 2:30 a.m., her vehicle skidding to a halt mere inches from a concrete barrier. I couldn't help but recall the mannequin's new pose, hands raised as if warding off an unseen force. The weight of what was unfolding pressed upon me with every ticking second. The mannequin was more than an antique, she was a messenger, a vessel of fate, or perhaps a warning carved in bone and cloth. Sleep became a stranger, replaced by hours of restless vigil. Shadows deepened in every corner, and the boundary between the living world and whatever realm the mannequin inhabited blurred and bent. Yet amid the growing dread, I felt a strange kinship with her, a silent partnership bound by mystery and a shared burden of secrets waiting to unfold. Each night, as the clock edged toward 2 a.m., I found myself holding my breath, waiting for the next silent message cast in porcelain and shadow. Her gaze held mine with an intensity that rooted me to the spot, yet her expression was devoid of menace, only a deep, aching sorrow. She lowered her hand slowly, almost reluctantly, and took a step back, blending into the shadowed corners of the workshop. "I'm a fragment," she seemed to say without words, a whisper of a life unfinished. The room grew colder as the weight of her presence settled over me like a heavy fog. The warmth that had radiated moments before was replaced by a chilling emptiness, as if she carried the hollow echo of memories too painful to bear. I swallowed hard, struggling to make sense of the impossible. Why show me this? Why come alive now? Her eyes shimmered with something close to regret, reflecting 1,000 silent stories. Without a word, she turned, her figure dissolving slowly into the dim light, leaving behind a faint scent of autumn leaves and distant rain. I sank into my chair, the noise of the workshop fading around me. The line between restoration and haunting had blurred irrevocably. She was no longer just an object to fix, but a living testament to something beyond time and repair, a soul caught between worlds, reaching out for release. In the days that followed, her poses grew less frequent, but their meaning deepened. Each silent gesture seemed to be a plea, a message I was destined to decode. And I knew, with a certainty that shook me to my core, that the restoration was not just of broken antiques, but of unfinished lives, including hers, and perhaps mine. The elevator jolted as the doors slid shut with a metallic screech, sealing me in a small, claustrophobic space that suddenly felt like a coffin. The lights flickered erratically, casting grotesque shadows on the polished brass buttons, and the air grew thick and oppressive, almost suffocating. My pulse quickened as the elevator began its descent, but the ride was unlike any I'd experienced before. The usual hum of machinery was replaced by a deep, resonant vibration that thrummed through my bones. Each floor we passed seemed to stretch on endlessly, numbers flickering past the indicator with no pattern, no logic. The elevator slowed near the 13th floor, then stopped abruptly. The doors opened to reveal a dimly lit hallway that didn't resemble any modern building I knew. The wallpaper was peeling, faded floral patterns long forgotten by time, and the air was heavy with the scent of damp plaster and old smoke. A distant echo of footsteps, soft, measured, reverberated through the corridor, but no one was visible. The silence around me was thick with anticipation, as if the building itself was holding its breath. I stepped out cautiously, the elevator doors closing behind me with a sound that felt final. The hallway stretched into shadows, its ends swallowed by darkness. As I moved forward, the walls seemed to pulse faintly, like a living thing breathing slowly, rhythmically. My footsteps stirred the stale air, which whispered with a chorus of half-remembered voices and muted cries. Every door I passed was shut tight, but I could feel eyes watching from behind them, unseen presences lingering in the gloom. Then, at the end of the hall, a door creaked open slowly, revealing a room bathed in sickly yellow light. Inside, an old woman sat knitting by a flickering fire, her face obscured by shadows. She looked up, and for a moment, our eyes locked, hers empty, ancient, and full of secrets. The weight of unspoken truths pressed upon me, and I realized that the apartment building was more than just bricks and mortar, it was a vessel of memories, pain, and forgotten souls. The elevator had delivered me not to a home, but to a place suspended between worlds, a crossroads where the past and present collided, and where my own story was about to be rewritten. The air was thick and heavy, pressing against my chest like an unseen weight. Every breath felt labored, as if the hallway itself was exhaling a suffocating fog. The silence was absolute, broken only by the faint, almost imperceptible sound of something moving just beyond sight, soft footsteps or the whisper of fabric brushing against the walls. I stepped forward tentatively, the heels of my shoes muted against the plush carpet, each step echoing unnervingly down the endless corridor. The doors lining the hallway were unfamiliar and ancient-looking, their dark wood polished to a cold gleam. Each door was numbered in faded gold leaf, but the sequence made no sense, some numbers repeated, others missing entirely. Shadows flickered at the edges of my vision, elusive and quick, always vanishing when I turned to look directly. A chill crept up my spine as I neared the far end of the corridor where a single door stood slightly ajar. Faint, flickering light spilled out, casting dancing shapes across the carpet. I hesitated, heart pounding in my ears, then pushed the door open. Inside was a room frozen in time, a parlor with antique furniture draped in white sheets, crystal chandeliers dimly glowing with an ethereal light. In the center stood a large ornate mirror, its surface rippling like disturbed water. As I approached, the reflection did not mirror my movements perfectly. Instead, it showed fleeting images, shadowy figures standing behind me, scenes from decades past, faces distorted with grief and longing. The whispers began then, faint at first, growing louder until they filled the room with voices speaking in tongues I couldn't understand. I staggered back, the oppressive presence closing in, the floorboards creaking beneath invisible feet. The elevator doors closed behind me with a finality that sealed my fate. The Meridian building had revealed its true nature, not a mere home, but a labyrinth of memories and spectral echoes where time bent and reality frayed. And I was trapped inside its endless, shifting corridors, a visitor in a house that remembered everything, and forgot nothing. The glow from the laptop screen cast flickering shadows across the room, revealing scattered papers and an unfinished letter lying half-folded on the bed. Through the narrow gap, I saw myself pacing the floor, fists clenched, voice low and trembling as I confronted Jake about a secret I discovered, one that shattered our friendship. The weight of betrayal pressed on me as I remembered the lies I told afterward, the quiet unraveling of trust that followed like a slow poison. My hands shook as I stepped away, the names on the plaques burning like searing brands in my mind. Each door was a chamber of memory, a tomb of regrets I had tried so hard to bury. The door labeled betrayal yawned before me, darker and colder than the rest. Beyond it lay a scene I wished I could forget but never could, the moment I had abandoned a friend in need, choosing convenience over courage. The face of that friend, etched with disbelief and hurt, haunted me in the flickering candlelight of that room. Drawn forward by some cruel gravity, I moved toward the door marked cowardice. The room beyond was a mirror of 1,000 missed opportunities, the times I had been too afraid to speak up, too timid to stand my ground. The air inside was thick with silence and the heavy scent of regret. I felt my chest tighten as if the very walls pressed inward, suffocating with the echoes of my own failings. The door named lies revealed a labyrinth of half-truths and whispered deceptions. In the dim glow, I watched myself weaving stories to protect fragile facades, sacrificing honesty for acceptance. Each whispered lie had built a prison more confining than any physical walls. Weakness was a room shrouded in shadows, where I saw my own reflection fractured, fragile moments of vulnerability twisted into shame and self-recrimination. The weight of these memories threatened to crush me, yet I could not look away. Finally, I faced the door marked failure. The room was empty except for a cracked mirror reflecting a broken version of myself. The silence there was deafening, filled with all the times I had fallen short and the dreams I had let slip through trembling fingers. The hallway's oppressive pulse quickened as I stood surrounded by the ghosts of my past mistakes. Each step forward was a confrontation with the parts of myself I had long denied. And though the air was thick with despair, within me a flicker of resolve began to burn. I knew then that to escape this endless corridor, I had to face these memories, not as burdens, but as keys. Only by confronting the shame, guilt, and failure could I hope to unlock the path back to light and freedom. A cold panic flooded me, sharp and suffocating. I pounded the solid wall with trembling fists, the sound muffled and meaningless. The corridor stretched endlessly now, the 7 doors rearranged in a shifting pattern, like a maze designed to trap me in my own guilt. The wallpaper's thorns had grown thicker, curling with malicious intent, reaching out as if to drag me back into the shadows of my past. The whispers grew louder, swirling in my ears, indistinguishable yet accusing. I covered my face, trying to shut them out, but they burrowed deeper, tracing every fault, every regret with merciless precision. The air thickened, heavy and suffocating, each breath a struggle against the invisible weight pressing down on my chest. And then, in the corner of my eye, the door labeled Hope flickered faintly, a door I hadn't noticed before. Tentatively, I approached, fingers trembling as I reached for the handle. The moment my palm touched the cold brass, the corridor around me seemed to dissolve into a hazy mist, softening the edges of my torment. Beyond the door lay a room bathed in gentle light. The wallpaper was soft, pale blue with delicate white blossoms, and a window opened to a sky awash in dawn's first glow. Inside, I saw myself, not as I was now, but as I might be. A man who had faced his failures and learned from them, who carried his scars with quiet dignity. A man who, despite the weight of his past, dared to hope. Tears blurred my vision as the whispers softened, replaced by a silence that felt like peace. The walls ceased their pressing, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I breathed freely. The elevator doors reappeared, sliding open with a welcoming sigh. I stepped inside, heart pounding not with fear, but with fragile resolve. As the car ascended, the metallic taste in my mouth faded, replaced by the crisp sweetness of possibility. I knew the journey ahead would be long and uncertain, but I was no longer trapped in the shadowed hallway of my past. I was moving forward, toward light, toward healing, toward the hope I had nearly forgotten. The photograph should have been empty, just crumbling stone walls and weathered foundations beneath an overcast sky. But when I developed the film that night, I found a figure standing in the center of the ruins, a woman in a white dress, translucent and flickering like a flame caught in a breeze. Her eyes, hauntingly hollow, seemed to stare right through the lens, into the depths of my soul. I hadn't seen anyone near the site when I took the picture, and no one lived within miles of the abandoned village. The local folklore whispered of a tragedy, a wedding day gone wrong, a bride who vanished without a trace, her spirit said to linger, waiting for a love lost to time. Each time I visited the ruins, the feeling of being watched thickened like mist around me. I heard soft footsteps on broken stone, the faint rustle of silk skirts, a whispered lullaby carried on the wind. The villagers avoided speaking of the place, their eyes darkening with unspoken fear. The photograph was just the beginning. The apparition grew clearer in each new image I captured, sometimes close enough to see the delicate lace of her veil, the sorrow etched in every line of her pale face. Yet, when I looked directly, she was gone, only the empty ruins remained, silent and still. I found myself drawn back night after night, unable to resist the pull of that mournful presence. It was as if the ruins themselves held a secret, a story unfinished, and I was the only one who could bear witness. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I set my camera on a tripod and waited. The air chilled, shadows lengthened, and the figure appeared again, this time reaching out, her transparent hand trembling as though yearning for release. I whispered a promise to tell her story, to remember the forgotten. In that moment, the ruins seemed to breathe with relief, the oppressive silence giving way to a gentle peace. The photograph should have been empty, but instead, it captured a timeless echo, a reminder that some histories refuse to fade, living on in shadows and light, waiting for a witness to set them free. The more I thought about it, the more it felt like the figure was drawn to me specifically, as if I were the one it had been waiting for all these years. The village's dark history weighed heavily on my mind. They said Millbrook had been cursed, abandoned overnight when the river changed course and strange disappearances plagued its residents. But those were just old stories, folklore meant to scare children and entertain tourists. Still, the figure's presence defied any logical explanation. It was never in the same place twice, always just on the edge of vision, never fully revealed, but undeniably there, silent, watching, patient. It became a ghost not just of the village, but of something deeper, something rooted in the very soil and stone beneath my feet. One evening, driven by a mixture of fear and obsession, I returned after dark, armed only with my camera and a flashlight. The ruins were cloaked in mist, the outlines of broken walls blurred and softened in the moonlight. I moved slowly, every crunch of gravel underfoot sounding too loud in the eerie silence. Then, as I paused near the well, I felt a sudden coldness wash over me. The air grew thick, the night soundless save for my own ragged breathing. And there, just beyond the edge of my flashlight's beam, the figure emerged, not from shadow, but from the mist itself. Its hood fell back slightly, revealing a face pale and sorrowful, eyes deep pools of regret. It raised a hand, pointing toward the ruins as if demanding I see something I'd overlooked. I lifted my camera, snapping pictures despite the shaking in my hands. The flash illuminated the figure briefly before it faded back into the night like a wisp of smoke. In the photos, the figure stood clearer than ever. And behind it, faint shapes began to materialize, ghostly silhouettes of villagers, frozen in moments of joy and despair. I realized then that the figure was no mere specter, but a guardian, a keeper of memories, a watcher of forgotten souls trapped in the ruins' silent grasp. My obsession turned from fear to purpose. I knew I had to tell their story, to give voice to the unseen, and to honor the shadows that lingered in the forgotten village of Millbrook. But the pull was irresistible. I parked near the village entrance as the rain softened into a steady drizzle. The mist clung to the trees like ghostly veils, and the air felt thick with anticipation. Every step I took echoed with the weight of unseen eyes. The ruins, usually silent and still, seemed to breathe around me, shadows flickering just beyond my sight. I raised my camera, heart pounding, and began to retrace my usual paths. Near the chapel, the ground was slick with rain, the stones glistening under the overcast sky. As I framed a shot of the shattered altar, movement caught my eye, a flicker of a dark cloak slipping between broken columns. I froze, breath catching in my throat. The mist thickened, swallowing the figure whole. Suddenly, a low whisper rose on the wind, unintelligible yet filled with an ancient sorrow. Goosebumps prickled my skin as the air turned colder, the rain ceasing as if the storm itself held its breath. Marcus's voice echoed in my mind, "They're watching, waiting for their story to be told." I realized then that I wasn't just an observer but a conduit. The village's silent guardians needed their memories preserved, their unfinished tales brought to light. The weight of their presence shifted, not from menace, but from yearning. With renewed purpose, I raised my camera once more, capturing not just images but fragments of lost lives and whispered histories. The figures remained hidden in the mist, but their watchful eyes no longer filled me with fear. Instead, they offered a solemn invitation, to remember, to honor, and to bear witness. Their faces were hidden beneath deep shadows, but I could feel their eyes, cold, ancient, unblinking, fixed on me like the silent guardians they were rumored to be. The light from my flashlight trembled in my grasp, casting long, jagged shapes that seemed to writhe and twist in the damp air between us. One stepped forward, raising a gloved hand slowly, as if in greeting or warning. The rustle of their cloak was the only sound breaking the oppressive stillness. My heart hammered so loudly I was sure they could hear it. Then, in a voice that was both everywhere and nowhere, echoing as if spoken from beneath the earth itself, came words I didn't understand, but somehow knew, a plea, a lament, a yearning for release. I lowered my flashlight, swallowing the urge to run, and met the unseen gaze. The figures shifted, their forms becoming less forbidding, more human in the wavering light. Faces appeared, etched with sorrow, time, and memories too heavy to bear. In that moment, the weight of centuries seemed to press down, not to crush, but to invite. An understanding blossomed. These were not malevolent watchers, but echoes of lives paused, tethered to this place by unfinished stories and unspoken truths. I raised my camera once more, not to capture a ghost, but to honor a history yearning to be remembered. The hooded figures faded slowly into the mist, their presence lingering like a promise. And as dawn broke over Millbrook, I felt, for the first time in weeks, a fragile peace settle into my bones, an unspoken agreement between the living and the forgotten, bound forever by the stories we choose to carry forward. Their presence was a silent plea, not for vengeance or fear, but for remembrance, for acknowledgement of lives once lived and lost beneath the shadow of time. As the first light of dawn brushed the ruins, the figures dissolved fully into the morning haze, leaving behind only the cool breeze that whispered through the stones and trees. A profound stillness settled over the village, an unspoken covenant renewed. I stood alone amidst the quiet, heart still pounding but filled with a solemn reverence. The weight of centuries had pressed upon me, not to burden, but to remind, that memory, respect, and the act of bearing witness are perhaps the most enduring legacies we leave behind. Turning away from the chapel, I carried their stories with me, not as burdens, but as gifts. For in remembering, we honor those who came before, and in doing so, keep the fragile flame of their existence alive within our own. But the pull of curiosity was stronger than caution. I swallowed the knot in my throat, tightened my grip on the flashlight, and stepped inside. The narrow passage swallowed me whole, the light from the entrance fading into thick, suffocating darkness. Every step echoed strangely, as if the cave itself whispered secrets I was not meant to hear. The air grew colder still, each breath a sharp sting, and an almost imperceptible hum thrummed beneath my feet. The walls, rough and slick, seemed to close in, narrowing as I moved deeper, until I reached a chamber bathed in an otherworldly glow. In the center stood an ancient stone altar, etched with symbols that pulsed softly like a heartbeat. The carvings told stories older than the mountain, tales of forgotten rites and promises bound in shadow. As I stepped closer, a voice, not heard but felt, brushed against my mind, a whisper weaving through the silence. "Welcome to the threshold, traveler. Beyond this lies the path you must choose, between what is and what might be, between the living world and the eternal unknown. A chill washed over me, but within that cold, a strange clarity took root. I had come seeking adventure, but found instead a reckoning. The mountain was not merely rock and earth, it was a guardian of secrets, a sentinel of thresholds best left unpassed. Yet here I was, standing at the brink. Taking a deep breath, I chose to step forward, into the mystery and the darkness, ready to face whatever truths awaited beyond the fading light. The words pressed into the stone with an unsettling clarity, as if etched by a hand that knew my every secret and fear. My throat tightened, breath catching in a sudden panic. How could this be? This chamber, this tunnel beneath the mountain, was not merely a physical place, it was a repository of memory, a tomb of forgotten warnings and choices. The inscription continued, unfolding like a story I had long buried. The child stumbles, ignores the quiet voice, and ventures too far. The water calls, cold and merciless. The price is paid in silence. A cold shiver ran down my spine as the flicker of my headlamp caught movement in the shadows beyond the wall. Something unseen, watching, waiting. My fingers brushed the stone, tracing the letters as if seeking reassurance that I was still tethered to reality. But the chill beneath my skin whispered otherwise. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to look beyond the inscription into the cavernous dark. There, faintly glowing in the distance, was a light, flickering like a beacon or a warning. The mountain had more to reveal. And I had no choice but to follow. The walls twisted and elongated, their inscriptions multiplying like a living script that consumed the very space around me. My footsteps echoed hollowly as I fled, but no matter how fast or far I ran, the chamber seemed to fold and shift, closing in like a trap woven from my own regrets and fears. The voice followed, relentless and cold, reciting my thoughts before I could fully form them. He will search in darkness. He will beg for mercy that will not come. He will fall to despair but rise again, for the cycle must continue. Panic clawed at my mind as I pressed my back against the cold stone, the beam of my headlamp flickering with exhaustion. Somewhere in the labyrinth of shadows, a presence loomed, watching, waiting for me to surrender. Summoning every shred of strength, I took a deep breath, steadying my trembling hands. This place was built not just to imprison, but to reveal. To force reckoning with truths too heavy to carry in daylight. I would not run anymore. Turning my gaze back to the glowing inscriptions, I whispered to myself, I am here. I will face what comes. And with that, the words began to change, not accusations, but questions. Invitations. Doors opening in the stone for the first time. A gentle shift in perspective, a quiet unraveling of certainty. The cave wasn't a prison built of stone and shadow, it was a mirror carved from the depths of my own mind. The labyrinth of inscriptions, the endless corridors, the suffocating silence, they were echoes of my fears, my doubts, the walls I had built around myself to keep pain at bay. Slowly, I began to see the space not as a trap but as a passage. The inscriptions were not sentences of doom but lessons etched by my own hand, reminders of choices that had shaped me and those I still had the power to change. I let the flashlight's beam soften, no longer searching for an exit, but for understanding. With every breath, the weight of the mountain eased, replaced by a fragile hope, the hope that freedom was never found by running, but by facing the shadow within. The cave awaited no longer to consume, but to transform. And as I took a step forward, the stone beneath my feet felt less like cold rock and more like the foundation of a new beginning. My steps felt heavy as I emerged from the darkness of the cave, each cold breath cleansing layers of fog that had long clouded my mind. The grinding sound of stone against stone echoed softly, a gentle reminder that the fears we face are not the invisible walls outside, but the barriers we build within ourselves. The story does not end here, it has only just begun. For every step taken toward the light is also a step deeper into the core of oneself, where courage is not a weapon but an act of acceptance and surrender. In that moment, I understood that those dark caves, those waiting inscriptions, are not traps but mirrors reflecting our own journey, the journey from confusion to clarity, from imprisonment to freedom.